Clara Whitmore tore the foreclosure notice from the bank clerk's shaking hand and shoved it straight into the mouth of her father's burning oven. "Tell Cornelius Hargrove," she said, "this bakery burns before I hand him the keys." She had until sunrise to pay every dollar she owed or lose the only thing her father had ever built. The whole town believed she was already finished. Then at midnight, a stranger's boots stopped outside her door and asked how many loaves she had left. Before we go any further, if stories like this one warm your heart, hit that subscribe button and stay with me for the whole journey tonight. And drop a comment with the name of the city you're watching from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. Clara Whitmore tore the foreclosure notice out of the clerk's trembling hand before he could finish nailing it to her door, marched straight across the flour-dusted floor, and shoved the paper into the roaring mouth of her father's stone oven. "You go on back and tell Cornelius Hargrove," she said, her voice low and hard as river stone, "that this bakery burns to the ground before I hand him the keys." The clerk stumbled backward over the doorframe, and by the time the sun rose, half of Willow Creek would know that Samuel Whitmore's daughter had spit in the bank's eye. She had until sunrise to pay what she owed or lose the only thing her father had ever built with his own two hands. The clerk, a thin young man named Jasper Higgins, righted his spectacles and backed toward the street. "Miss Whitmore, I'm only doing my job." "Then do it somewhere else tonight," Clara said. "You've got until morning, same as I do. Get." Jasper fumbled with his satchel. "Mr. Hargrove said if the note ain't paid by sunup, the sheriff comes with the papers. I ain't the one you should be sore at." "I'm not sore," Clara said, though her hands were shaking as she said it. "I'm just done being polite about it." He left without another word, and Clara stood alone in the bakery for a long moment, listening to her own heartbeat, to the low crackle of the fire, eating the notice to ash. She pressed both hands flat against the counter her father had built the year she was born, and she made herself breathe. "He's not taking this place," she said to the empty room. "Not tonight. Not ever." The door in the back creaked, and Odette Krause, her nearest neighbor, and the only soul in town who still called on Clara without an excuse, stepped through with a shawl thrown over her nightgown. "I heard shouting." "You heard me telling that boy where he could put his notice." Odette's mouth twitched half a laugh she didn't let out. "Lord Clara, you can't go burning bank papers. They'll say you're unstable. They'll say a woman living alone, running a business alone, ain't fit. Let them say it." Clara wiped flour from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "They've been saying it since Papa died. Too big to run a bakery. Too slow. Too soft in the head to manage numbers. I've heard every word of it." Odette whispered behind my back at the mercantile, like I can't hear a whisper same as anybody else. "I didn't come to fight with you," Odette said gently. "I came because I saw the lamp lit, and I know what tonight means." Clara looked at the ledger open on the counter, the numbers scratched in her father's careful hand, and her own less steady one beneath them. $340. That was the debt. That was the whole of her father's life reduced to a figure written in ink. And if she didn't have it by sunrise, Cornelius Hargrove would have the sheriff nail a different kind of paper to that door, one with his own name on the deed beneath it. "I've got 48 loaves rising," Clara said. "If I sell every one of them before sunup at fair price, I'm still short. But it's something. It's more than nothing. Sell to who? Ain't nobody buying bread at midnight. Then I reckon I'll be standing in this doorway till somebody does." Odette studied her for a long moment, the way an old friend studies someone who has finally said something true out loud. "Your daddy would be proud of you tonight, whether you sell 1 loaf or 50. My daddy would still be alive if his heart hadn't given out over these same numbers," Clara said, and the words came out sharper than she meant them, sharp enough that Odette flinched. Clara pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to snap at you." "You've got a right to snap at somebody tonight. Just don't let it be at me, because I'm the only one standing in this kitchen willing to help you carry flour." That got a real laugh out of Clara, short and tired, but real. "Then grab that sack by the door and quit lecturing me." They worked in near silence after that. Odette kneading dough with hands too thin for the work, but willing all the same, Clara stoking the oven, checking the loaves, wiping sweat from her brow with a forearm dusted white. The bakery had been quiet like a church since Samuel Whitmore's funeral 6 months back, and Clara had learned that grief did not announce itself in the daylight hours when there were customers to greet and bread to sell. Grief came at times like this in the dead hours before dawn, when the fire was the only voice in the room, and her father's absence sat in the corner like a shadow that never quite lifted. She remembered him standing right where she stood now, flour on his forearms, telling her, "Clara girl, a bakery ain't about the bread. It's about being the one thing in this town that don't ever run out." She had believed him. She still believed him. But belief did not pay a note to the bank of Willow Creek, and belief did not stop Cornelius Hargrove from wanting this corner lot for himself, so he could put up whatever grand building men like him always wanted to put up in towns that weren't big enough yet to need one. She had gone to see him that very afternoon, hat in hand, though she owned no hat, and had gone bareheaded into his office instead, which she now suspected he'd taken as one more mark against her. "Mr. Hargrove," she'd said, "I need more time." He had not looked up from his papers right away. When he finally did, his eyes moved over her the way they always did, assessing her size before they ever reached her face, and Clara had learned long ago to hold still under that look rather than shrink from it. "Miss Whitmore, your father's note has been extended twice already. The bank has been more than patient." "The bank has been collecting interest twice already," Clara said. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a week. I can pay it all with a week." "A bakery run by a woman alone," Hargrove said, folding his hands. "In a town this size cannot be expected to generate the kind of revenue that debt requires. I mean no disrespect." "You mean every bit of disrespect," Clara said. "You just want to say it in a voice that sounds polite while you say it." His jaw had tightened at that, the closest she'd ever seen him come to losing his composure. "Sunrise, Miss Whitmore." Not a minute passed. She had walked out of that office with her spine straight, and her hands balled into fists at her sides, and she had not let a single tear fall until she was 3 streets away, and certain no one from the bank could see her do it. Now standing in her own kitchen with flour to her elbows, and Odette humming some old hymn under her breath to keep herself steady, Clara allowed herself one more thought of her father before she buried it and went back to work. "I'm not going to lose it, Papa. Not tonight. Not while I've still got hands that can knead and an oven that still burns." By the time the church bell rang for midnight, there were 48 loaves cooling on the long table by the window, and Willow Creek was as dark and silent as a held breath. Clara stood at the door with her apron still tied and her hair coming loose from its pins, staring out at a street with not a single soul on it. "Nobody's coming, Clara," Odette said softly. "Not at this hour." "Then I'll stand here till somebody does." "You're stubborn as a mule." "I'm my father's daughter," Clara said. "That's the same thing near enough." A boy of perhaps 12, Tobias Reyes, who swept the bakery floor most mornings in exchange for yesterday's bread, appeared at the back door, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Miss Whitmore, I heard you were baking through the night. My ma sent me to see if you needed help." "Bless your mother," Clara said, "and bless you for coming, but there's nothing left to bake. It's selling. I need now, and there's nobody left awake in this whole town to sell to." Tobias frowned, thinking hard the way children do when they believe a problem has a simple answer adults have simply failed to find. "What about the ranch hands? They come through sometimes real late when they're driving cattle to the rail line." Clara opened her mouth to tell the boy that was a foolish hope that no rancher rode through Willow Creek after midnight looking for bread, and that was exactly the moment she heard it hoofbeats, slow and heavy, coming down the empty street from the north road. Odette went still. Tobias's eyes went wide. Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest, something between hope and dread, because hope was a dangerous thing to feel when you had already been disappointed by an entire town. The horse stopped outside her window. A man swung down from the saddle with the kind of easy, practiced motion that told Clara he had spent more nights of his life on a horse than off one. He was tall, broad through the shoulders dust on his coat, and 2 days of hard riding written into the lines of his face. He looked at the lit window, at the shelves of bread visible through the glass, and something in his shoulders eased like a man who has been carrying worry a long way and has just set some small part of it down. He knocked once out of habit more than need, since the door was already open to the night air. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat. "I don't mean to trouble you at this hour. I saw your light from the road." Clara straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, and made herself speak like a woman running a business, and not a woman on the edge of losing everything, though her voice betrayed a small tremor at the end of the sentence, despite her best effort. "We're open. What can I get you?" He looked past her at the loaves lined up on the table, more bread than any one man could want, and something crossed his face that Clara couldn't quite name. "That's a powerful lot of bread for one bakery to have sitting out at midnight." "I baked it to sell," Clara said. Whether the hour makes sense to sell it in is a different question. That earned the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "Name's Ethan Calloway. I run the Calloway spread up past Widow's Ridge about 2 hours' ride from here. My crew's been eating cold beans and hardtack for 3 days because the chuck wagon broke an axle, and I told my boys I wouldn't come back without something better than that." "Then you've ridden into the right bakery at a strange hour, Mr. Calloway." "Reckon I have." He studied the bread again, then studied her the way a man studies something he is trying to understand rather than something he is trying to judge. "How many loaves you got, ma'am?" Clara's throat tightened around the number because the number was the whole of her night's labor, the whole of her hope, and speaking it out loud to a stranger felt like handing him a piece of herself she hadn't decided yet whether she could spare. 48, she said. Ethan Calloway, looking at the loaves one more time, unhurried, the way a man looks at something before he commits to a decision he intends to keep. Then he looked back at Clara, and he said the 6 words that would upend everything she thought she knew about that night, about herself, and about what a stranger's kindness could cost a person who had learned not to trust it. "I'll take all of them." For a moment, Clara could not make her mouth work. Odette let out a small gasp behind her. Tobias grinned so wide it looked as though his face might split in two. "All 48, Clara repeated, needing to hear it a second time before she would let herself believe it. "All 48, Ethan said. "My crew's hungry and my word's good. I'll pay fair price cash on the table, and you can watch me count it out if that eases your mind any. It's not that I doubt your word, Mr. Calloway. It's that nobody in this town has bought more than 2 loaves off me at once since my father passed. And you're standing here offering to clear my whole shelf at midnight like it's the most ordinary thing in the world." "Maybe where you're from it ain't ordinary," Ethan said. "Where I'm from, a man who sees a woman working through the night to keep her business alive doesn't ask a lot of questions about why. He just does what needs doing." He reached into his coat and produced a leather purse worn soft at the seams from years of use. "Now you gonna help me load this bread, or am I gonna have to guess which loaves are which and carry them out myself?" Clara found her voice again somewhere in the middle of that sentence. "I'll help you, Mr. Calloway. But I should tell you plain, since you've been decent enough to be plain with me, even selling every loaf tonight won't cover what I owe the bank by sunrise. I don't want you thinking your kindness is buying me out of trouble. It can't buy me out of." Ethan's expression didn't change much, but something in his eyes sharpened the way a man's eyes sharpen when he hears a piece of information he intends to keep. "How much trouble are we talking, if you don't mind my asking?" $340, Clara said, and speaking the number out loud a second time that night, this time to a stranger with kind eyes and dust on his boots, felt somehow heavier than it had felt in Hargrove's office that afternoon. "This bread will get me maybe half that, if I price it fair, and you're as generous a buyer as you seem. That's a fair sight of money for a bakery this size to owe." "It's my father's debt," Clara said. "He took a loan to repair the oven 2 winters back, and between his illness and the funeral costs, and the slow months after it grew faster than I could pay it down. Cornelius Hargrove's given me until sunrise to make it whole, or the sheriff comes with papers to take the deed." "Hargrove," Ethan said, and something flickered across his face at the name, something that looked almost like old recognition, though Clara didn't press him on it, not yet. Not when there was bread to load and a debt to somehow outrun before the sun came up. "I know the name," Man's got a reputation for wanting land more than he wants honest business. You know him. I know of him, Ethan said carefully. Let's get this bread loaded, Miss Whitmore, and then you and I are going to talk about what else you might need tonight, because I don't much like the idea of riding off with a wagon full of your bread while you stand here about to lose everything else you own. I don't need charity, Mr. Calloway. Didn't offer any, he said. I offered to talk. There's a difference, and I expect a woman smart enough to run a bakery through a debt like this on her own can tell the difference plain as I can. Clara studied him for a moment. This stranger who had ridden in out of the dark with dust on his coat, and an easy honesty in his voice that she had not heard directed at her in longer than she cared to admit. She thought of Hargrove's cold assessment that afternoon, the way his eyes had moved over her sighs before they ever reached her face, the way his voice had wrapped disrespect in the silk of politeness. Ethan Calloway had looked at her exactly once at the start, the way any stranger looks at anyone they've just met, and then he had simply stopped looking and started listening instead. That was a difference Clara understood better than most people in Willow Creek ever gave her credit for understanding. All right, she said, let's load your wagon, Mr. Calloway, then we'll talk. They worked together in the cool night air, Clara wrapping loaves in cloth and passing them to Ethan, who stacked them with a care that surprised her, as though bread mattered to him beyond its use as mere provisions. Odette watched from the doorway, with her arms crossed and an expression Clara couldn't quite read somewhere between suspicion and hope. Tobias ran back and forth fetching extra cloth from the shelf, clearly delighted to have a task in the middle of such an unusual night. Your crew's going to think you rode into a miracle, Odette said, unable to help herself. Might have, Ethan said, not looking up from his stacking. Wouldn't be the first time this bakery smelled like one from the road. I could smell that oven 2 streets back before I ever saw the light in the window. You flatter my baking, Mr. Calloway. I don't flatter, ma'am. I state facts as I find them. He set the last loaf into place and straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. Now, $340 minus whatever this bread earns you. What's the difference? Clara did the arithmetic in her head. The same arithmetic she had done a dozen times that night, already hoping each time the numbers might somehow rearrange themselves into something kinder. If you're paying fair market for 48 loaves, that's somewhere near $160. That leaves me short by close to $180. That's still a considerable gap for one night. It is, Clara admitted. But it's smaller than it was an hour ago, and an hour ago I didn't think it could get any smaller at all. I'll take what progress the night gives me, Mr. Calloway. I've learned not to ask for more than that. Ethan was quiet for a moment, turning his hat over once in his hands, the way a man turns a decision over before he commits to speaking it aloud. My ranch needs a steady supplier. Chuck wagon breaking down like it did, that's going to keep happening on a spread as big as mine unless I find somebody in town willing to bake regular and reliable week after week, rain or shine. I was going to have to find somebody eventually. Might as well be somebody I already know can bake bread worth riding 2 hours in the dark for. Are you offering me a job, Mr. Calloway? I'm offering you a contract, he said. Different thing entirely. A job a man tells you what to do and pays you what he decides you're worth. A contract 2 parties agree on terms because both of them need something the other one's got. I need bread delivered to my ranch every week. You need money you can count on instead of money you have to pray for. Seems to me like an agreement, not a rescue. Clara felt something tighten in her chest, some old defensive instinct rising up out of 6 months of being underestimated, of being offered pity, dressed up as kindness by townsfolk who thought a large woman running a bakery alone needed saving more than she needed respecting. I don't want anyone thinking I only kept this bakery because a rancher took mercy on me. I'm not taking mercy on you, Ethan said, and there was an edge in his voice now, not unkind but firm, the voice of a man correcting a misunderstanding he didn't intend to let stand. I watched you work tonight before I ever knocked on that door. I sat on my horse at the edge of the light for near a full minute, watching you move through this kitchen like you'd been born in it, and I have never once in my life offered a business arrangement to somebody out of mercy. I'm not built that way, and if you ask around Widow's Ridge, you'll find plenty of folks willing to tell you so. Then why offer it to me at all at midnight to a woman you've known for less than half an hour? Ethan considered the question with a seriousness that told Clara he intended to answer it honestly rather than smooth it over with charm. Because I've seen what happens to a business when the person running it gives up an hour before things would have turned around. I don't intend to watch that happen twice in my life if I can help it. Something in the way he said twice caught Clara's attention, a weight behind the word that suggested a story he wasn't ready to tell a stranger at midnight, and she filed it away, rather than pressing him, because she understood the shape of a wound a person wasn't ready to show yet. She had plenty of her own. "All right, Mr. Calloway," she said. "I'll agree to your contract. Weekly bread delivered to your ranch at a fair price we can settle on once the sun's up and I've had time to think straight. But that still leaves me short tonight, and tonight is the only night that matters because tonight is when Cornelius Hargrove's clock runs out. Then we'd best figure out where the rest of that money's coming from before the sun clears the ridge," Ethan said. "Because I didn't ride 2 hours into this town to watch a woman lose her father's bakery over $180 while I stand around admiring her nerve. You don't have that kind of cash sitting in your saddlebag, surely." "No, ma'am, I don't. But I know men in this town who owe me favors, and I know a banker's clerk who looked mighty uneasy leaving this bakery earlier tonight, which tells me there's more happening here than one widow's daughter falling behind on a note. Men like Hargrove don't send clerks out at midnight to nail up notices unless they're in an almighty hurry to get their hands on a piece of land." Clara's stomach turned over. "You think he wants the bakery for more than the debt? I think a corner lot on the main street of a growing town is worth considerably more than $340, Ethan said. "And I think a man who's already extended a note twice, suddenly deciding tonight's the night he calls it due, that's not patience running out. That's opportunity showing up." "What kind of opportunity?" "That," Ethan said, settling his hat back onto his head, "is exactly what I intend to find out before this night is finished." Odette, who had been listening from the doorway with growing alarm, stepped forward at last. "Mr. Calloway, with respect, you're a stranger to this town. Cornelius Hargrove has half the council in his pocket and a reputation for making trouble disappear when it stands between him and something he wants." "Ma'am, I've dealt with men like Hargrove my whole life," Ethan said. "Ranching puts a man across the table from bankers more often than he'd like. I know how they think, and I know how they hide what they're really after behind numbers on a page. If there's something crooked sitting under this debt, I intend to drag it out into the light before sunrise, same as Miss Whitmore intends to sell every loaf of bread she's got." Clara looked at him for a long moment. This stranger who had ridden into her night with dust on his coat and an offer that asked nothing of her except her bread and her trust, both of which she had learned the hard way not to give easily. "Why does this matter to you, Mr. Calloway, truly? You could have loaded your bread and ridden home 2 hours ago and never thought of Willow Creek again." Ethan's jaw worked for a moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had lost some of its easy confidence, replaced by something rawer underneath. "My family lost a bakery once. Different town years back. A bank called a note due faster than it should have, and nobody stood in the doorway at midnight to ask why. I was young. I didn't understand what was happening until it was already gone, and I've carried that a long way since. I don't aim to ride past the same thing twice in one lifetime and tell myself it wasn't my business." The words settled over Clara like a hand placed gently on her shoulder, and for the first time that whole terrible, hopeful night, she felt the corner of her eyes sting with something that wasn't grief. "I'm sorry that happened to your family." "I'm sorry it's happening to yours," Ethan said. "But I don't intend to let it finish happening if there's a way to stop it. Now. You said you've got 48 loaves loaded $160 coming and 180 short. Let's see what else this town's got hiding in its pockets before the sun comes up, because I've got a feeling Cornelius Hargrove isn't the only person who owes you something tonight." Tobias, who had been listening with the rapt attention of a boy, witnessing something far more interesting than sleep, spoke up suddenly. "Miss Whitmore, my pa says half the ranch hands passing through here owe you for bread they never paid full price on account of you always giving credit to families that were short." Clara blinked. "Tobias, that's not—" "It's true though, ain't it?" the boy pressed. You gave the Delgado family bread all last winter and never once asked for money, and old Mr. Finch still owes you for near 2 months of loaves from before his leg healed." Ethan looked at Clara with an expression that mixed surprise and something warmer beneath it. That true Miss Whitmore. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed at having her private generosities aired in front of a stranger. A person doesn't refuse bread to a family with hungry children just because their purse is thin that week. My father raised me that way, and I don't intend to raise myself different just because he's gone. Then it seems to me, Ethan said slowly, that half this town owes you a debt. They've been letting slide, same as you're about to lose everything over a debt you can't slide even one more day. Seems only fair some of that comes back around tonight. I'm not going to go knocking on doors demanding people repay bread debts at 1 in the morning, Mr. Calloway. That's not who I am. Didn't say you should, Ethan said. Said I would. You've got a night's worth of bread to finish selling and a banker's scheme to untangle. Let me handle the knocking. Before Clara could argue, hoofbeats sounded again from down the street, faster this time, urgent, and a rider came into view at a near gallop, pulling up hard enough that his horse skidded on the packed dirt. It was Walt Dehaney, an older ranch hand Clara recognized from her father's funeral. A man who had worked cattle in the valley for 30 years and owed allegiance to no one but his own sense of what was right. "Miss Whitmore," Walt called, swinging down before his horse had fully stopped. "I heard from my nephew that Hargrove's clerk was seen riding out to the Pruitt place not an hour past, and I got to thinking on why a banker's man would be visiting the Pruitts at this hour, seeing as the Pruitts don't owe the bank a dime." Clara's heart began to pound in a new and different way. "What are you saying, Walt?" "I'm saying," Walt said, catching his breath, "that the Pruitt place backs right up against your bakery's lot line, and old Amos Pruitt's been talking for months about selling his land to whoever offers first, on account of his rheumatism getting too bad to work it anymore. If somebody wanted to build something big on this corner of town, they'd need both parcels, not just yours." Ethan's expression turned sharp and focused the look of a man who has just found the thread he was searching for. "Hargrove's not just after Miss Whitmore's debt. He's assembling land." "For what?" Clara asked, though some cold certainty was already forming in her stomach even before anyone answered. "Could be anything," Ethan said. "A hotel, a second bank, a rail depot if he's got word the line's extending this direction sooner than the town's been told. Whatever it is, it's worth enough to him that he's willing to squeeze a grieving woman out of her father's bakery on a technicality rather than give her the one more week she asked for this afternoon." Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides, and for the first time that night, the trembling in them wasn't from fear or exhaustion, but from something closer to fury. "He sat across that desk from me today and told me the bank had been more than patient. He looked me in the eye and let me believe this was about money I owed when the whole time he was counting the minutes until he could take the ground out from under me for reasons that had nothing to do with any debt at all." "That's about the shape of it far as I can tell," Walt said grimly. "Then we'd better find proof of it before sunrise," Ethan said. "Because a suspicion whispered over a bakery counter isn't going to stop a sheriff from serving papers, but a signed record of land dealings just might." Clara looked from Ethan to Walt to Odette. 3 people standing in her father's bakery in the dead hours of the night, each of them willing to fight a battle that had begun as hers alone, and something inside her chest, some tight and guarded thing she had carried since her father's funeral, loosened just slightly for the first time in 6 months. "All right," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I've got 26 loaves left on that shelf and less than 5 hours before sunrise. If we're going to prove Cornelius Hargrove is lying about why he wants this bakery, we'd best start moving, because I don't intend to lose my father's life's work to a man who can't even be bothered to be honest about why he wants to take it." Ethan set his hat firmly on his head and looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of respect, or perhaps something that had already gone a little further than respect in the short hour since he'd knocked on her door. "Then let's get to work, Miss Whitmore. Sunrise waits for nobody, and neither I'm starting to think do you." Walt was already moving toward his horse before Clara finished speaking. "I'll ride out to the Pruitt place myself. Amos and I go back to before either of us had gray in our beards. If Hargrove's clerk was out there tonight offering him money for that parcel, Amos will tell me plain, especially once I explain what it means for you. Take Tobias with you, Ethan said. Two sets of eyes remember more than one, and the boy's sharp. Tobias straightened so fast, he nearly knocked over a stack of empty flour sacks. I won't slow you down, Mr. Dehaney, I swear it. Didn't say you would, son, Walt said, already swinging back up into his saddle. Just said bring your eyes and your ears and leave the talking to me. He looked down at Clara one last time before he turned his horse toward the road. Hold that bakery together till I'm back, Miss Whitmore. You've held it together this long on nothing but stubbornness. Don't quit on me now that you've got help standing in the room. I don't quit, Clara said. I never have. No, Walt said. I don't reckon you have. And then he and Tobias were gone into the dark hoofbeats fading north toward the Pruitt land. Odette wrung her hands in her apron. What do you need from me, Clara? Stay here and mind the last of the bread, Clara said. If anybody else comes through that door, wanting to buy sell to them, take their money, and don't let a single loaf go to waste. Every dollar tonight is a dollar that keeps my father's name on that door a little longer. And you, Clara looked at Ethan, who was already checking the cinch on his own horse, preparing to ride. I'm going to see Cornelius Hargrove myself before this night is through, and this time I'm not going to stand there with my hat in my hands, since I don't own a hat and never did, and let him talk down to me like I'm a child who doesn't understand her own numbers. Clara, it's the middle of the night. The man's asleep in his bed. Then I'll wake him, Clara said, and there was something in her voice now that hadn't been there earlier that evening, some hardened resolve forged out of 6 months of grief and one strange, hopeful hour, with a stranger who had refused to look at her the way the rest of the town did. He didn't extend me the courtesy of honesty this afternoon. I don't see why I owe him the courtesy of waiting for a decent hour. Ethan swung up onto his horse and held out a hand to help her up behind him. An offer Clara hesitated over for exactly as long as it took her pride to argue with her common sense and lose. You sure about this, Miss Whitmore? I've spent 6 months letting this town decide what I am and am not capable of, Clara said, taking his hand and swinging up behind him. Tonight I intend to decide that for myself. They rode through the sleeping streets of Willow Creek until they reached the wide porch of Cornelius Hargrove's house on the good side of town, purchased, Clara now suspected, with money squeezed from people who could least afford to lose it. Ethan helped her down, and Clara marched up the steps and pounded on the door before she could talk herself out of it. It took 3 rounds of knocking before a light appeared in an upstairs window, and several minutes more before Cornelius Hargrove himself opened the door in a dressing gown, his hair disheveled, his expression thunderous at being roused from sleep by the very woman he had given until sunrise to disappear quietly. Miss Whitmore, have you lost your senses entirely? I've found them actually, Clara said. Somewhere around the time I learned you sent your clerk to the Pruitt place tonight to buy land that has nothing to do with my father's debt. Whatever color remained in Hargrove's face at that hour drained further still. I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I think, Ethan said, stepping up beside Clara with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who has spent his life facing down people who believe their money made them untouchable, that you're assembling 2 parcels of land on the corner of Main Street, and you need Miss Whitmore's lot to make whatever you're planning worthwhile. I think you called her father's note due tonight, not because the bank ran out of patience, but because you ran out of time to wait for her to fail on her own. And who exactly are you? Hargrove demanded, drawing himself up to his full, unimpressive height, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Ethan Calloway of the Calloway Ranch up past Widow's Ridge. And I'll tell you plainly, Mr. Hargrove, I've got friends on the Territorial Land Office who'd be mighty interested to hear about a banker quietly buying up adjoining parcels the same week he calls in a widow's debt early, especially if there's a rail spur or a depot contract sitting behind it that the town hasn't been told about yet. There is no impropriety in a bank collecting on a debt that is legitimately owed, Hargrove finally managed. Nobody said there was, Ethan said calmly. I only said it's an interesting coincidence a note called due the same week you go land shopping next door. Coincidences like that have a way of drawing attention from folks who examine bank ledgers for a living. Clara stepped forward closer than perhaps was wise, but she had run out of patience for being careful around a man who had spent an entire afternoon lying to her face with a polite voice. "You told me this afternoon that the bank had shown more patience than it should. You let me believe I was the failure here, Mr. Hargrove. You let me walk out of your office thinking I had brought this on myself through poor management, when the whole time you knew exactly what you needed my land for, and exactly how little time you intended to give me to keep it." "Miss Whitmore, I assure you." "Don't," Clara said, and the single word came out with such force that Hargrove actually took a step back. "Don't assure me of anything else tonight. I have spent 6 months in this town being told in one polite phrase after another that I am too large, too slow, too unfit to keep what my father built. I believed some of it, Mr. Hargrove, on the darkest nights when the bakery was empty, and I was alone with nothing but a ledger full of numbers I didn't know how to make smaller. But I know now that none of it was ever about whether I could run this bakery. It was about whether you could get your hands on the ground beneath it." The porch went silent. Hargrove's eyes flicked between Clara and Ethan, calculating the way Clara imagined he calculated every figure that crossed his desk. "Even if what you suggest were true," Hargrove said slowly, choosing each word with visible care, "the debt itself remains real. $340 due by sunrise. That has not changed, regardless of whatever else you believe you have uncovered tonight." "No," Ethan agreed. "It hasn't. So I reckon Miss Whitmore had best get back to her bakery and finish earning it while I make sure a few particular people in this territory hear about tonight's conversation before the week is out." Hargrove's composure cracked at last, just slightly, just enough for Clara to see the fear underneath the polish. "There is no need to involve outside parties in what is after all a private banking matter." "There's every need," Clara said, "when a private banking matter is built on a lie told to a grieving woman's face. I'll have your $340 by sunrise. Mr. Hargrove, every cent of it, and you'll sign my father's note paid in full with your own hand. But you should know that this isn't finished between us just because a debt is settled. A town deserves to know what its banker is really building on the corner of Main Street, and I intend to see that they find out." She turned before he could answer, walked back down the porch steps with her spine straight, and did not look back to see whatever expression had settled onto Cornelius Hargrove's face in the wake of her words. Ethan fell into step beside her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the cold night air settling around them as the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly began to ebb. "That was either the bravest thing I've seen a person do in some time," Ethan said finally, "or the most reckless. I haven't quite decided which." "Can't it be both?" Clara asked, and despite everything, despite the debt still unpaid and the sun still hours from rising, she felt something almost like a laugh rise up in her chest. "I suppose it can," Ethan said, and this time his smile reached all the way to his eyes. "Come on, Miss Whitmore. We've still got bread to sell and $180 to find before that sun clears the ridge, and something tells me tonight isn't finished handing out surprises just yet." They rode back toward the bakery, beneath a sky just beginning almost imperceptibly to soften at its eastern edge. When they arrived, the kitchen window glowed warm against the retreating dark, and through the glass, Clara could see Odette wrapping the last few loaves for a small cluster of ranch hands, who must have wandered in during her absence. "You sold more?" Clara said, half question, half disbelief, as she slid down from the horse. "Word travels faster than you'd think even at this hour," Odette said, counting coins into her apron pocket. "Seems a rumor got around that the widow's daughter told off Cornelius Hargrove on his own front porch in the middle of the night. Half these men rode over just to shake your hand." Clara laughed, a real laugh this time, startled out of her by the strangeness of the night. "I didn't do it for applause." "Don't matter what you did it for." One of the ranch hands called from near the counter, a weathered man missing 2 fingers on his left hand. "Man's been squeezing folks in this valley for years. Good to see somebody finally stand up and say so to his face." Walt returned not long after, Tobias riding double behind him, both of them windburned and grinning despite the hour. Amos Pruitt confirmed it, Walt reported, swinging down. Hargrove's clerk offered him near triple what that land's worth on the condition he sign quiet and quick before month's end. Amos smelled something wrong about it and sent the clerk off without an answer. Said he'd been meaning to come tell you about it in the morning. Miss Whitmore, only he didn't know it mattered so much until Tobias here explained the whole of it on the ride back. Then we've got our proof, Ethan said. 2 parcels, 1 banker, and a debt called due at the exact moment it would clear his path. That's not coincidence. That's a plan, and now there's enough people standing in this bakery who know it that Hargrove can't quietly make it disappear. Clara looked around the room at the small, unlikely gathering that had assembled around her in the space of a single night. Odette with flour dusted across her nightgown. Tobias practically vibrating with the thrill of having helped uncover something real. Walt leaning against the counter with the satisfied look of a man who had settled an old score on behalf of a friend's daughter, and Ethan still dusty from 2 days of riding standing near the door as though he belonged there, as though he had always belonged there, though she had known him for scarcely 3 hours. I still owe the bank $340 by sunrise, Clara said quietly. Proof of scheming or not. Hargrove made that plain enough on his own porch. Then let's count what we've got, Ethan said, because between your bread money and whatever these good people are willing to put toward a woman who's fed this valley on credit for longer than anybody's kept proper track, I suspect we're closer to that number than you think. Coins began to appear on the counter, 1 small stack at a time. The ranch hand with the missing fingers put down more than the fair price of his loaves and waved off Clara's protest with a gruff shake of his head. Walt added what he called an old debt long overdue, though Clara could not recall him ever owing her a cent. Odette emptied her apron pocket entirely despite Clara's insistence that she keep something back for herself. Even Tobias produced 2 coins from somewhere in his trouser pocket, solemnly placing them beside the rest, and refused every attempt Clara made to return them. Clara stood over the growing pile of coins with her hand pressed against her mouth, unable for a long moment to trust her own voice. I don't understand, she finally managed. 6 months, and no one in this town so much as offered me a kind word at the mercantile. Tonight strangers and neighbors alike are emptying their pockets onto my counter. Maybe it took a night like this one for folks to see plainly what was always true, Odette said gently. Or maybe some things just take the right kind of midnight to come loose. Ethan added his own contribution to the pile, last quiet and unassuming, as though it were simply the next loaf being stacked, rather than an act of remarkable generosity from a man who had known her for a matter of hours. Clara opened her mouth to refuse it, then closed it again, understanding somehow that refusing it now would be its own kind of pride, the kind that helped no one, least of all herself. Walt counted the coins twice to be certain, and when he finished, he looked up at Clara with an expression caught somewhere between relief and wonder. $341, Miss Whitmore. You've got it. You've got it, and $1 besides. The sound that came out of Clara then was half laugh and half sob. 6 months of grief and fear and stubborn, lonely determination breaking loose all at once in the gray light just beginning to creep through the bakery windows. Odette wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Tobias whooped loud enough to startle the ranch hand's horse outside. And Ethan Calloway stood a little apart from the celebration watching Clara with an expression she did not yet have the composure to read, though something in it made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with grief at all. We'd best get this to Hargrove's office the moment it opens, Ethan said finally. And get that note marked paid in full before the man finds some new excuse to delay it. We will, Clara said, wiping her eyes with the back of her flour-dusted hand. But not yet. Let me have this moment first, Mr. Calloway. Let me stand in my father's bakery with the sun coming up and the debt paid, and people who care about me standing all around before we go back out into the world and fight whatever comes next. Ethan tipped his hat. The gesture, slow and deliberate, weighted with something that felt to Clara like the beginning of a promise rather than the end of a night. Take all the time you need, Miss Whitmore. I've got a feeling this isn't the last sunrise the 2 of us are going to see through together. Outside, the sky over Willow Creek turned the pale gold of early morning, and the smell of fresh bread drifted out through the open bakery door into a town that did not yet know how much had changed within its walls before the sun ever cleared the ridge. The sun cleared the ridge while Clara still stood at her own counter, with coins stacked in front of her, and Ethan Calloway leaning against the doorframe like a man who had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. Odette had gone home to change out of her nightgown before the whole street saw her in it, and Tobias had fallen asleep, sitting upright in the corner chair, worn clean through by the strangest night of his young life. Walt stood watch by the window, arms crossed, waiting for the moment the bank's shutters would finally open. "They open at 7, Walt said. "Hargrove's clerk unlocks the door same time every morning, rain or shine." "Then we'll be standing on that step at 7, Clara said, gathering the coins into a small burlap sack with hands that still trembled slightly from exhaustion and everything else the night had carried. "I want that note marked paid before that man has time to invent some new reason to delay it." "Smart thinking," Ethan said. "Men like Hargrove need time to build a lie. Don't give him any." They walked the short distance to the bank, together the four of them, Odette having returned in a fresh dress just in time to join the procession, and by the time they reached Main Street, word of the night's events had clearly outpaced them. Shopkeepers stood in their doorways. A cluster of women near the Mercantile stopped their morning gossip mid-sentence to watch Clara pass, and for once in 6 months, Clara did not lower her eyes or quicken her step to escape their attention. She walked straight down the center of the street with her chin level and the sack of coins held against her chest like something precious because it was. "Look at her," one of the women murmured, not quite quiet enough. "Walking like she owns the whole street." "Maybe she's earned the right," another voice answered, and Clara recognized it as belonging to Mrs. Finch, whose husband's leg had kept him from working half the winter, whose family had eaten Clara's bread on credit for 2 months running without a single word of complaint from the bakery counter. The bank door was unlocked precisely at 7, and Jasper Higgins, looking considerably more nervous than he had the night before, stepped aside to let them in without a word of protest. Cornelius Hargrove was already seated behind his desk, dressed and composed once more. Every trace of the disheveled man from his own front porch scrubbed away and replaced with the same cold, polished manner Clara had faced the previous afternoon. "Miss Whitmore," he said, folding his hands atop his desk. "I trust you've come to discuss an extension." "I've come to pay my father's note in full," Clara said, setting the sack down on his desk with a sound heavier than its size suggested it should make. $340. Count it yourself if you doubt me." Hargrove's eyes flicked to the sack, then to Ethan standing just behind her shoulder, then to Walt and Odette filling the doorway like a wall Clara had not needed 6 months ago and desperately needed now. He counted the coins slowly, deliberately, as though hoping the act of counting might somehow rearrange the sum into something short of what was owed. $341, he said finally, and something bitter crossed his face at having to say it aloud. "Then you'll mark the note paid," Clara said, "and sign it in your own hand, same as you'd have signed the deed over if I'd come up short." Hargrove reached for his pen with visible reluctance, and for one terrible moment Clara feared he might refuse outright, might invent some new obstacle on the spot to keep her from walking out of that bank with her father's legacy still intact. But the pen scratched across the paper, and the note was marked paid, and Hargrove pushed it across the desk toward her with the expression of a man swallowing something foul. "There," he said, satisfied. "Not entirely," Clara said, folding the paper and tucking it into her apron pocket as though it were the most ordinary transaction in the world, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "I still intend to see this town learn what you were really after with my father's corner lot, Mr. Hargrove. A paid debt doesn't erase a lie." "You have no proof of anything," Hargrove said, and for the first time that morning his composure slipped just enough to let something sharper show underneath. "Suspicion and gossip are not evidence Miss Whitmore and I would think carefully before repeating accusations you cannot support in a court of law. We'll see what the Territorial Land Office thinks about coincidence," Ethan said mildly. "When they hear a banker offered a widower triple market value for a parcel the same week he called in an old debt he'd already extended twice." Hargrove's jaw tightened, and for a moment the two men simply looked at each other across the desk. One dressed in dust and honest labor, the other in a suit that had clearly never known a day of it. "You would be wise, Mr. Calloway, not to make enemies in a town where you own no land and hold no standing. I've made worse enemies over smaller wrongs, Ethan said, and slept just fine every night since. They left the bank with the paid note in Clara's pocket and a silence trailing behind them that felt less like victory and more like the calm before something larger. Clara did not fully exhale until they were 3 doors down, standing outside the Mercantile in the full light of morning. "He's not finished," she said quietly. "A man like that doesn't let go of a plan just because one piece of it fell through." "No," Ethan agreed. "He doesn't. Which means we'd best find out exactly what he's building before he finds another way to build it." Walt cleared his throat. "I can ride back out to the Pruitt place proper this time with daylight to see by and see if Amos is willing to put what he told me last night down on paper signed and witnessed. A written statement carries more weight than a tired old rancher's word passed second-hand." "Do that," Ethan said. "And I'll ride up to the land office myself, see if there's any record yet of a rail survey through this valley. If Hargrove's building toward a depot contract, there'll be paperwork somewhere, even if he's tried to keep it quiet." Clara looked between them. This small circle of people, who had in the space of one impossible night become something she had not let herself hope for since her father's funeral. "And what do I do?" "You bake," Odette said firmly. "Because whatever else happens today, this town still needs bread, and you've got a contract with the Calloway Ranch to think about now, besides." Clara laughed despite herself, surprised at how quickly ordinary life had reasserted itself, even in the middle of a fight that felt anything but ordinary. "I suppose I do." But ordinary did not last the morning. Clara had barely gotten the first batch of dough rising when Tobias came bursting through the front door breathless, his earlier exhaustion apparently burned away by whatever news he carried. "Miss Whitmore," he gasped, "there's men out at your storage shed, the one behind the bakery where you keep the extra flour sacks. I saw them from the alley. They're loading it onto a wagon." Clara's hands went still in the dough. "Loading it where?" "I don't know, but they ain't dressed like your regular delivery men, and one of them's got a face like he don't want to be recognized." Clara was out the back door before she finished untying her apron, and what she found behind the bakery made her blood run cold, in a way the bank's cold arithmetic never had. 3 men strangers to her were hauling sacks of her flour reserve, the flour she had set aside for the Calloway Ranch contract, onto the bed of an unmarked wagon. "That's my flour," Clara said, her voice carrying more authority than she felt in that moment. "Put it down." One of the men, broad and unshaven, barely glanced at her. "Got orders to clear this shed, ma'am. Ain't nothing personal." "Orders from who?" The man hesitated just long enough for Clara to understand the answer before he ever spoke it. "Can't say. You can and you will," Ethan said, appearing suddenly at Clara's shoulder with a stillness in his voice that carried more threat than any shout could have managed. "Because right now, you're 3 men caught stealing flour off a woman's property in broad daylight, and unless you'd like the sheriff involved in exactly that description of events, you'll tell us who sent you before you finish loading that wagon." The unshaven man's eyes flicked between Ethan's steady gaze and his 2 companions, calculating the odds of a fight he clearly did not want. "Fella paid us cash, said the shed belonged to the bank now on account of a debt. Didn't ask questions past that. Man don't pay us to ask questions." "The debt's paid," Clara said, pulling the folded note from her apron pocket and holding it out where all 3 men could see Hargrove's signature scrawled across the bottom. "Signed this very morning. Whoever sent you here either doesn't know that yet or doesn't care." The men exchanged a look, and something in Clara's steady voice in the paper held out plain for them to see, seemed to shift the balance of the moment. "We don't want no trouble, ma'am," the unshaven man said finally. "We'll put it back." "You'll put it back," Ethan agreed. "And you'll tell us plain who hired you before you ride off, or I'll make certain the sheriff hears a very different version of this morning's events." It took another minute of tense negotiation, but the flour sacks came back off the wagon one by one, and the man finally admitted in a low, reluctant voice that a man named Silas Reed had approached them at the saloon the night before with cash and instructions to clear the shed before sunrise, claiming the bank had already seized the property. Clara had never heard the name before, but Ethan's face darkened the moment it was spoken. "Silas Reed," he repeated. "You're certain that's the name he gave?" "Certain as I'm standing here," the man said. Once the wagon had rattled away and the flour was safely restacked, Clara turned to Ethan, whose expression had gone tighter than she'd seen it since he'd first ridden up to her door. "You know that name." "I know it," Ethan said grimly. "Silas Reed works for a land syndicate out of Denver, buys up parcels ahead of rail expansion, and flips them at triple value once the surveys go public. If he's operating in Willow Creek, it means the rail line isn't a rumor. It means Hargrove's already sold information to outside money, and he's trying to clear every obstacle off this corner before the surveyors arrive, and the whole valley finds out what their land is about to be worth. Then he tried to have my shed cleared before the ink on that paid note was even dry," Clara said, fury rising hot in her chest. "He didn't care that the debt was settled. He was going to take what he wanted regardless, and dress it up as bank business if anyone asked." "Which means paying off the note this morning didn't stop him," Ethan said. "It only slowed him down. A man that determined doesn't quit because one door closed. He starts looking for the next one." That afternoon, the next door revealed itself in a way none of them expected. Clara was delivering bread to the Calloway Ranch for the first time under their new arrangement, riding beside Ethan in the wagon, with the scent of fresh loaves filling the air between them, when they came upon a scene at the edge of Calloway land that stopped both their hearts at once. A section of fence had been cut, cattle scattered across two properties, and one of Ethan's ranch hands lay in the dirt, with blood matting the side of his head. "Get down," Ethan said, already leaping from the wagon before it had fully stopped rushing to the fallen man's side. Pete, can you hear me?" The ranch hand groaned, struggling to sit up despite Ethan's hand pressing him gently back down. "3 riders," Pete managed. "Cut the fence, ran the herd toward the ravine. I tried to stop them, and one of them caught me with the butt of his rifle." "Did you see their faces?" "Too dark, and my head was ringing before I could look proper. But I heard one of them say something about the surveyors coming through by month's end. Said something about needing this section clear before then." Clara knelt beside the wounded man, tearing a strip from her apron to press against the wound at his temple. Her hands moving with the same steady competence they used every morning shaping dough. "He needs a doctor, Ethan. This cut's deep. I'll take him myself," Ethan said, already lifting the man with a careful strength that spoke of long practice, hauling injured cattle and injured men alike. "Clara, can you ride back to town and fetch the sheriff? Tell him what's happened here. Tell him about the flour theft this morning, too. 2 incidents in one day. Same day. The land syndicate's name comes up. That's not coincidence. A sheriff can ignore." "I can ride," Clara said, though she had not sat a horse in longer than she cared to admit, her days having been consumed entirely by flour and dough and grief since her father's death. "I'll manage." "I know you will," Ethan said, and something in the way he said it, quick and certain without a flicker of the doubt she had grown so used to seeing in other people's eyes, steadied her more than she expected. "Go on. I'll get Pete to the doctor and meet you at the sheriff's office within the hour." Clara rode back toward town harder than she had ridden in years, her muscles aching by the time Willow Creek's rooftops came into view, and she burst into the sheriff's small office with her hair wild from the wind, and her voice shaking with urgency she no longer bothered to hide. "Sheriff Cole," she said, "I need you to come with me. Someone's cut Calloway fence line, scattered his cattle, and hurt one of his men, and I believe it connects to a land scheme Cornelius Hargrove's been running on the corner lot next to my bakery." Sheriff Cole, a broad, graying man, who had known Clara's father for 20 years, looked up from his desk with the particular weariness of a man who had spent a career sorting truth from town gossip. "That's a considerable accusation to lay at a banker's feet, Miss Whitmore." "It's not an accusation, Sheriff. It's what happened. This morning, 3 men tried to clear my flour shed, claiming the bank had already seized it, though I'd paid the note in full not an hour before. A man named Silas Reed hired them, and Ethan Calloway tells me Reed works for a land syndicate buying up parcels ahead of a rail survey. Now this afternoon someone's cutting fence and running cattle on Calloway land in that exact same section, and a ranch hand's been hurt bad enough to need a doctor. Sheriff Cole's expression shifted from weariness to something more alert as the pieces Clara laid out began visibly to assemble themselves in his mind. Silas Reed, you say? You know the name. I know a wire came through the telegraph office 2 weeks back, addressed to Cornelius Hargrove from a Denver office with Reed's name on the return line. Didn't think much of it at the time. Bankers wire Denver all the time. He stood reaching for his hat and his gun belt in the same motion. But a wounded man and a cattle run on the same day a banker's associate starts hiring thieves to clear property. That's not something I can set aside as coincidence. They rode together toward the Calloway Ranch, and Clara found herself praying in the wordless way she had not prayed since her father's illness, that Pete would recover, and that whatever was coming next would not cost anyone more than a scattered herd and a bruised skull. But the day was not finished, revealing its cruelties. When they arrived, Ethan met them at the yard with a grimness in his face that told Clara something new had gone wrong even before he spoke. Pete's with the doctor, should mend fine, Ethan said. But while I was riding back from town, I found this nailed to my own front gate. He held out a folded paper, and Clara's stomach dropped the moment she saw it, because the hand that had written it was unmistakably the same careful, cold script she had seen on her father's foreclosure notice the night before. Sheriff Cole took the paper and read it aloud, his voice hardening with every word. Mr. Calloway, interference in matters that do not concern you carries consequences beyond what you may anticipate. Consider this a courtesy you will not receive twice. No signature. That's a threat, Clara said, her voice tight with fury and fear tangled together. That's Hargrove threatening you outright. Can't prove the hand, Sheriff Cole said grimly. But I've read enough of the man's correspondence over the years to have a fair notion whose fingers held that pen. Ethan's jaw was set in a way Clara had not yet seen something harder and more dangerous beneath his usual easy calm. He can threaten me all he likes. I've stared down worse men than a banker hiding behind other people's fists. But he's made a mistake putting it in writing, Sheriff, because now it's not just suspicion and coincidence. It's a documented threat delivered the same day as an assault and an attempted theft, all tangled up with the same names. Sheriff Cole folded the note carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. I'll need statements from all of you. Pete's once he's able. Yours, Miss Whitmore, about the flower shed. Yours, Mr. Calloway, about this note and the fence line. And I intend to pay Cornelius Hargrove a visit myself this evening, official this time, not a midnight porch confrontation between private citizens. He'll deny everything, Clara said. He's had a lifetime of practice at it. Maybe. Sheriff Cole allowed, but a man denying things gets harder to believe every time the denials pile up against evidence. And I've got a feeling this pile is only going to grow before it's finished. He was right sooner than any of them expected. That evening, as Clara sat at Ethan's kitchen table waiting for word on Pete's condition, a young rider arrived from town bearing news that made the whole evening tilt sideways once more. Amos Pruitt, the elderly rancher, whose land bordered the bakery lot, had been found unconscious in his own barn, having apparently fallen from a hayloft ladder sometime that afternoon. Is he alive? Clara asked, already on her feet. Alive, the rider confirmed, but hurt bad. And here's the strange part. His housekeeper says 2 men came by asking after him not an hour before she found him at the bottom of that ladder. Men she'd never seen before, and they left in an awful hurry once she came out to see who was calling. Ethan and Clara exchanged a look that needed no words to translate the same cold thought passing between them. Amos Pruitt, the one witness who could confirm under oath that Hargrove's clerk had offered him triple value for land tied to a scheme nobody in Willow Creek yet fully understood, had suddenly and conveniently suffered an accident on the very day Sheriff Cole began asking official questions. That's no fall, Ethan said quietly. That's a man silenced before he could sign a statement. We don't know that, Clara said, though her voice carried little conviction even to her own ears. We don't know it, Ethan agreed. But I'd wager everything I own that we're both thinking the same thing, and I'd wager Sheriff Cole will think it too the moment he hears the timing of it. They rode to the Pruitt place through gathering dusk, and Clara found herself gripping the edge of the wagon seat with white knuckles, not from the speed of the ride, but from the sick certainty settling deeper into her stomach with every mile. What had begun as a fight to save her father's bakery had grown in the space of a single day into something far larger and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined a debt of $340 could become. Amos Pruitt's housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Calder, who had worked for the family for 2 decades, met them at the door with red-rimmed eyes and hands that would not stop trembling. "Doctor says he might not wake before morning. Cracked his skull something fierce on that barn floor." "Mrs. Calder," Ethan said gently, "can you tell us anything more about the men who called on him?" "Anything at all. Even something that seems too small to matter." Mrs. Calder pressed a handkerchief to her mouth for a moment before answering. "One of them had a scar through his eyebrow right side, and I heard the other one call him Silas, plain as anything, right before they walked up to the barn." The name landed in the room like a dropped weight. Silas Reed, hired to clear a flower shed that morning, now apparently present at the scene of an elderly rancher's near-fatal fall that same afternoon. "That's enough for a warrant," Sheriff Cole said grimly, arriving just behind them with 2 deputies in tow. "Man's name tied to theft assault, and now this. I'll have him picked up before nightfall if he's still anywhere in this county." But Silas Reed, it turned out by the time the sheriff's men reached the boarding house where he'd been staying, was already gone. His room cleared out, his horse missing from the livery, leaving behind nothing but an unpaid bill and the unshakable sense that a man who had done exactly what he'd been sent to do had simply ridden on to his next assignment, wherever the syndicate needed him next. "He's run," Ethan said, standing in the empty boarding house room with his jaw tight. "Which means whoever's paying him knows we're closing in, and that man's not going to sit quietly waiting for us to connect the last threads." Clara felt something cold settle over her, a fear sharper than anything the bank's foreclosure notice had ever managed to summon. "You think Hargrove will do something more?" "I think a man who's already hired thieves, and I'd wager hired whoever put Amos Pruitt on that barn floor, is not a man who stops because a sheriff starts asking questions," Ethan said. "I think he gets more dangerous, not less, the closer we get to proving what he's done." That night, Clara could not sleep. She sat in her own bakery long after the ovens had cooled, staring at the paid note tucked safely in her father's old strongbox, thinking of Amos Pruitt lying unconscious in his bed, of Pete's bandaged head, of the threatening note nailed to Ethan's gate in Hargrove's unmistakable hand. She thought, too, though she tried not to let the thought take up too much room, of the way Ethan had looked at her across his kitchen table that evening, steady and unafraid, as though her fight had somehow become his own, without either of them ever formally agreeing to share it. A knock at her door near midnight startled her from her thoughts, and for one terrible instant, Clara feared it was Silas Reed himself, or worse, come to finish whatever violence he had started with Amos Pruitt. But it was Ethan's voice that called through the door, low and urgent. "Clara, it's me. Open up." She unlatched the door with hands that shook more from relief than fear, and the moment she saw his face, lit by the single lamp still burning in her window, she knew something new had happened. Something that had put a hardness in his eyes she had not seen there before. "What's happened?" "Sheriff Cole found something in Hargrove's office," Ethan said, stepping inside without waiting for invitation, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. "A search official backed by the warrant from Pruitt's assault. He found a ledger separate from the bank's regular books, tracking payments to Silas Reed, and to 2 other names Cole didn't recognize going back nearly 3 months. And Clara, the ledger shows a payment logged the very night your father's note was called due, paid to a man named Wendell Ashford." Clara's mind raced through the name, searching for some memory that might explain why it made her chest tighten with a dread she couldn't yet name. "I don't know that name." "I didn't either," Ethan said, "until Cole told me Ashford works for the Territorial Land Office, which means Hargrove wasn't just buying up parcels quietly. He had someone inside the land office feeding him information, maybe even helping him falsify records. And if that's true, this isn't just a corrupt banker running a scheme in one small town anymore, Clara. This reaches into the territorial government itself, and there's no telling how far up it goes, or how many people are protected enough to make sure this never sees the inside of a courtroom." Clara sank onto the edge of her own kitchen chair, the weight of it settling over her all at once. The debt that had felt only 24 hours earlier like the largest problem she would ever face in her life, now revealed as merely the smallest visible corner of something vast and rotten, reaching far beyond Willow Creek's town limits. "What do we do now?" she asked, and for the first time since the night had begun, her voice carried no trace of the fierce determination that had carried her through the bank, through Hargrove's porch, through every confrontation the day had demanded of her. What remained now was simply fear, honest and unhidden, for herself, for Ethan, for everyone who had stood beside her since midnight. Ethan knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the hardness still burning in his eyes. "We keep going," he said, "because a scheme this size doesn't survive daylight once enough honest people see it clearly. But Clara, I need you to understand something before we take another step forward. Reed's already run. Pruitt's lying hurt in his bed. A note's been nailed to my gate with a threat plain enough for a sheriff to read as intimidation. Whoever's behind this, and I don't believe for a second it stops at Hargrove alone, they've already shown they're willing to hurt people to protect what they're building. If we keep pulling this thread, it may not stop at broken fences and stolen flour." "Are you asking me to stop?" Clara asked quietly. "No," Ethan said, and something fierce and certain steadied his voice even as his hands tightened gently around hers. "I'm asking you to understand what we're walking toward with clear eyes, before you decide whether you're walking toward it with me. Because I intend to see this through, Clara Whitmore, whatever it costs, and I'd rather have your eyes open beside me than have you following blind into something that might yet turn dangerous in ways neither of us can predict." Clara looked at him for a long moment. This man who had ridden into her life scarcely a day earlier, and had in that short span become the first person in 6 months to look at her and see something other than a burden or a curiosity. She thought of her father, of the oven he had built with his own hands, of the 6 months she had spent alone, believing that strength meant carrying every burden without help, and she thought that perhaps her father had been wrong about that one thing, even as he had been right about nearly everything else. Before either of them could say more, Sheriff Cole himself appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, his face carrying the particular grimness of a man who had spent the last hour learning something he wished he hadn't. "I went to Hargrove's office again after the search," he said without preamble. "Told him what the ledger showed. Told him I intended to wire the territorial marshal in the morning." "And?" Ethan asked. "And he laughed at me," Cole said, disgust plain in his voice. "Told me Judge Prescott had already reviewed his land dealings and found nothing improper, and that I'd do well to remember who sat on the bench in this county before I went making accusations I couldn't make stick." Clara's stomach turned cold. Judge Prescott. The same judge who'd hear any case brought against him. "The very same," Cole confirmed. "Which tells me Hargrove isn't worried about a warrant because he believes he's already bought the man who'd have to sign one against him. I've served this county 11 years, Miss Whitmore, and I've never once seen a judge take a banker's side so plainly that the banker himself would brag on it to a lawman's face." "Then the sheriff's office alone won't be enough," Ethan said, his jaw tightening. "We need someone outside this county, someone Prescott and Hargrove don't already own." "The territorial marshal's a 3-day ride," Cole said. "And I can send the wire, but wires can be intercepted, delayed, made to disappear if the telegraph operator's on the wrong payroll, too. I don't know how deep this runs anymore, and neither do you. And that uncertainty is exactly the kind of thing that gets people hurt worse than a bruised skull or a burned shed." "Then we document everything ourselves," Clara said, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her voice. "Written statements witnessed and signed from everyone who's seen or suffered something these past 2 days. Pete's account of the fence cutting, Mrs. Calder's account of the men at Pruitt's barn, my account of the flour theft, yours about the note on your gate. If Prescott won't hear it, we carry it past him straight to the marshal's office ourselves in writing with enough names attached that no one can claim it was invented by a grieving woman and a stranger with a grudge." Sheriff Cole studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into the tired lines of his face. "Your father would have been proud to hear you talk like that, Miss Whitmore." "My father taught me that a ledger doesn't lie, even when the man reading it does," Clara said. I intend to build one Hargrove can't argue his way out of. They spent the better part of an hour drafting what statements they could. That very night, Cole taking down Clara's account in his own steady hand, while Ethan paced near the window, restless with an energy that had nowhere yet to spend itself. It was in the middle of that quiet, determined work papers spread across Clara's kitchen table, and the lamp burning low, that Ethan finally spoke the thought Clara had felt him circling for the better part of the evening. "I should have ridden straight past this town," he said quietly, not looking up from the window. "Bought my bread somewhere else, kept my crew fed some other way. And none of this would have touched you beyond a debt you'd have found some way to survive on your own, same as you've survived everything else since your father passed." "Don't," Clara said, setting down her pen. "Don't you dare sit there and try to carry the blame for men who cut fences and set old ranchers falling down ladders. That's Hargrove's doing, and whoever he's paying to do his dirty work, and none of it is yours to apologize for." "Maybe not," Ethan said, finally turning to look at her. "But I keep thinking that if I hadn't stopped at your door, you'd have lost the bakery, sure, but you'd still be safe tonight, instead of sitting in the middle of a scheme that reaches all the way to a judge's bench. And I'd rather be in the middle of a dangerous truth," Clara said, "than safe inside a comfortable lie, wondering for the rest of my life why a stranger's kindness felt too good to be real. I chose this, Ethan, same as you did when you decided a corner lot's worth of trouble was worth riding back into town for. Don't take that choice away from me now by deciding you regret giving it." Something in his expression softened at that some tension he had been carrying since the note on his gate, finally easing, if only slightly. "You're a hard woman to argue with, Clara Whitmore." "I've had a great deal of practice arguing with men who thought they knew better," she said. And for just a moment, despite the danger pressing in on every side, something like a real smile passed between them. A sudden pounding on the bakery door cut through the quiet like a gunshot. 3 hard knocks that made Odette's dog begin barking somewhere down the street, and both Clara and Ethan went still listening before Ethan crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled the door open to find Tobias standing there gasping for breath, his young face pale as flour in the lamplight. "Miss Whitmore," the boy managed between ragged breaths. "You gotta come quick. Mr. Doheny sent me. Somebody set fire to the Pruitt barn, the one Amos fell out of. And Walt says the flames are close enough to the house that they're moving Mrs. Calder and the doctor both out before it spreads." Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her as the full shape of the danger they had stepped into finally came into focus. No longer distant threats scrawled on paper or strangers vanishing in the night, but fire climbing toward a house where an unconscious man lay too broken to save himself. She was already reaching for her shawl before Ethan had finished pulling his boots back on both of them, moving now with the same fierce, wordless urgency. Sheriff Cole was already hoarse and shouting for his deputies by the time they reached the street, and the whole ride out to the Pruitt place passed for Clara in a blur of pounding hooves and rising smoke visible even from a mile off, an orange smear against the dark sky that seemed to grow larger with every stride the horses took. By the time they arrived, half the barn was already engulfed, flames roaring high enough to light the surrounding fields as bright as noon, and a line of men had formed between the well and the fire, passing buckets hand to hand in a desperate rhythm that seemed, against the size of the blaze, almost hopeless. "Where's Amos?" Clara shouted over the roar of the fire sliding from the wagon before it had fully stopped. "Out!" Walt called back, soot streaking his face as he hauled another bucket into the line. Mrs. Calder and 2 of the ranch hands got him clear before the flames reached the house. "He's in the wagon yonder, still breathing, still unconscious, but breathing." Relief washed through Clara so fast it nearly buckled her knees, but there was no time to feel it fully, because Ethan had already thrown himself into the bucket line beside Walt, his shirt sleeves rolled and his face set with the same hard determination Clara had seen in him since the moment he'd first knocked on her bakery door. She joined the line herself, passing buckets until her arms burned and her palms blistered, until the barn's roof finally caved inward with a groan like some great wounded animal, and a column of sparks shot up into the black sky. It took the better part of an hour before the fire burned itself down to something manageable. The barn reduced to a smoking, blackened skeleton, but the house standing untouched, a stone's throw away, saved by the line of exhausted, soot-covered townspeople who had refused to let it catch. Clara sank down onto an overturned water trough, her hands raw, her lungs aching from the smoke, and watched as Sheriff Cole walked the perimeter of the ruined barn, with a lantern searching the ground with the careful attention of a man who had seen enough fires in his time to know the difference between an accident and a message. "Over here," Cole called after a few minutes, and Ethan and Clara both made their way to where he crouched near the barn's far wall, well clear of where the fire had started at the loft where Amos had fallen. In the lantern light pressed into the dirt were the clear, deep prints of at least 2 men's boots, and beside them, half-burned but still legible, the remains of a kerosene tin that had no business being anywhere near a barn that stored nothing but hay and old harness leather. "That's no accident," Cole said grimly, turning the scorched tin over in his hand. "That's a man making certain a witness who already couldn't speak for himself would never get the chance to recover enough to try." Clara stared at the tin at the boot prints leading away into the dark toward the tree line, and felt something harden inside her chest that had nothing left in it of fear. "They tried to kill him, an old man who never did anything but tell the truth to a friend." "Looks that way," Cole agreed. "And whoever set this fire didn't run far enough yet that we can't still find them, not with tracks this fresh and a whole valley of men angry enough tonight to help me look." Ethan knelt beside the boot prints, studying them with the same careful attention he gave to reading cattle brands and weather signs, skills born of a lifetime spent noticing things other men walked past. "2 sets," he said slowly. "One heavier than the other, dragging slightly on the left, like a man favoring an old injury. That's not Silas Reed's stride. Reed walked light on his feet, quick, like a man used to running from trouble, rather than causing it outright." "Then there's more than one man doing Hargrove's dirty work," Clara said. "There's more than one man," Ethan agreed, rising slowly, his eyes still fixed on the dark tree line where the prints disappeared. "And if there's more than one man willing to burn a barn down around an unconscious witness, then whatever Hargrove's protecting is worth more to him than any of us have yet reckoned, and he's not going to stop simply because a bucket line saved a house tonight." Clara looked past him toward the wagon where Amos Pruitt still lay unconscious under a blanket, guarded now by 2 of Walt's men with rifles resting across their knees, and toward the blackened ruin of the barn, still smoking against the paling edge of the eastern sky, and understood with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest that whatever came next would not wait politely for morning to arrive before it found them. Ethan was already moving before the last of the smoke had cleared from his lungs, following the boot prints past the tree line with a lantern held low. Sheriff Cole and 2 deputies close behind him, rifles resting easy in the crooks of their arms, but ready all the same. Clara followed, despite Walt's protest that she stay behind with the wounded and the frightened, because she had not spent a full day fighting for her father's name, only to sit idle while the men who had tried to burn a witness alive slipped away into the dark. "Tracks split here," Ethan said, crouching at a fork in the trail where the trees thinned toward a dry creek bed. "One set heads toward the county road, the other cuts back toward town." "Toward town," Sheriff Cole said grimly, "means toward Hargrove." "Then that's the one we follow," Clara said, and there was no room left in her voice for anyone to argue otherwise. They tracked the second set of prints through the gray hour before dawn, the kind of light that made every shadow look like a man crouched and waiting, until the trail led them improbably, and yet somehow, inevitably, to the back door of the very bank Clara had walked out of that morning, with a paid note folded in her apron. A horse stood tethered there, lathered and blowing hard, still saddled, as though its rider had arrived only minutes before, and had not yet found time to see to it properly. "That's not Hargrove's horse," Ethan said. "He drives a buggy, never sits a saddle if he can help it." "No," Sheriff Cole agreed, "but I know that horse. Belongs to a man named Dutch Corrigan, hired muscle Hargroves used before for collections when a debtor got behind and needed persuading. Man's got a reputation for rough hands and rougher manners." The back door of the bank stood unlocked, and Sheriff Cole pushed it open with the barrel of his rifle, rather than his hand, stepping through into the dim interior, with the practiced caution of a man who had walked into worse rooms than a banker's private study before dawn. Clara followed close behind Ethan, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, and what they found inside stopped all 4 of them cold. Cornelius Hargrove stood behind his desk and his shirt sleeves disheveled for the second time in 2 days, and across from him stood a broad, scarred man with soot still streaking his forearms, and a kerosene smell clinging to his clothes that no amount of time could yet have washed away. Between them on the desk sat a leather satchel half open, stuffed with bundled cash thick enough to make Clara's breath catch. "Evening, Hargrove," Sheriff Cole said, leveling his rifle. "Or should I say morning? Either way, I believe you owe me an explanation for why Dutch Corrigan's standing in your office smelling like the inside of a burned barn." Hargrove's face went the color of old ash. "Sheriff, this is a private business matter." "Save it," Cole said. "Dutch hands where I can see them. Now." Dutch Corrigan's eyes flicked toward the door, toward the window, calculating an escape that a lifetime of rough work had taught him to always keep in mind. But 4 armed people standing between him and every exit left little room for calculation. His shoulders sagged, and something in him seemed to simply give up the fight before it had properly begun. "Wasn't my idea," Dutch said, his voice rough and low. "Hargrove paid me and another man $200 to make sure the old rancher didn't wake up talking. Told us to make it look like the fire started from a dropped lantern on account of the housekeeper being careless." "That's a lie," Hargrove said, too quickly, too loudly, his composure cracking wide open under the weight of his own hired man's confession. "I never instructed anyone to. You paid me in this very office not 4 hours ago," Dutch said, jerking his chin toward the satchel of cash on the desk. "The rest of my fee on account of a job you said needed doing quiet and quick, before the sheriff started asking too many questions about Pruitt's land. I got no reason to hang for you now that you're caught red-handed same as me." Clara felt something break loose inside her chest at those words. Some final restraint she had not even realized she was still holding on to, and she stepped forward before she could stop herself closer to Hargrove's desk than perhaps was wise with a confessed arsonist still standing in the room. "You tried to have an old man burned alive," Clara said, her voice shaking with a fury too large for her body to fully contain. "A man who did nothing but tell the truth to his neighbor. You sat across a desk from me 2 days ago and called me unfit to manage my own father's numbers, and this whole time you were the one running a scheme built on theft and violence and lies stacked on top of more lies. Miss Whitmore, I never intended for anyone to be harmed." "Don't," Ethan said, stepping between Clara and the desk, with a stillness that carried more menace than any raised voice could have managed. "Don't you dare stand there and pretend intention matters to a man lying unconscious in a wagon outside his own burned barn." Sheriff Cole moved forward, producing a set of iron manacles from his belt, with the grim efficiency of a man who had done this before and took no particular pleasure in doing it again. "Cornelius Hargrove, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson assault and attempted murder on the strength of Dutch Corrigan's confession and the evidence recovered at the Pruitt barn tonight. You have no authority," Hargrove said, though the fight had visibly drained from his voice even as the words left his mouth. "Judge Prescott will have these charges dismissed before the ink dries on your paperwork." "Maybe he will," Cole said, snapping the manacles closed around Hargrove's wrists. "But I've got a confessed arsonist, a satchel of marked bank money, and enough witnessed statements piling up in my office to make even a bought judge think twice about how loudly he wants to defend you in a public courtroom. And if Prescott does try to sweep this under, well, I've got a wire going out to the territorial marshal the moment the telegraph office opens, and this time I'll ride the message myself if I have to, so nobody along the line gets the chance to make it disappear." It was in that moment, with Hargrove standing manacled and pale behind his own desk, that Clara noticed the ledger lying open beside the satchel of cash, the same private ledger Ethan had described from Cole's earlier search. And something about the page it had fallen open to caught her eye with a force that stole the breath from her lungs entirely. "Ethan," she said, her voice suddenly unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with anger. "Look at this." Ethan crossed to her side and followed her trembling finger to a line of entries near the bottom of the page dated nearly 2 years back. The same winter her father had taken his loan to repair the bakery's stone oven. "That's my father's name," Clara said. "Samuel Whitmore. Loan amount $200, but the note I've been paying against says $280. Ethan, he only ever borrowed 200. I've seen his handwriting on the original agreement 100 times. He would have told me if the number had been different. Sheriff Cole leaned in to study the entry himself, his expression darkening further with every passing second. You're saying the bank's records show one figure and the note your father signed shows another. I'm saying... Clara said, her voice rising now with a fury that had found an entirely new and more personal target, that this man didn't just wait for my father's debt to grow into something he could exploit. He inflated it from the very beginning. Added $80 my father never borrowed, and let compound interest do the rest of the cruel work over 2 years until a $200 loan for oven repairs became a debt large enough to bankrupt an entire family. Hargrove said nothing, but the silence itself was confession enough, his eyes fixed somewhere on the floor rather than meeting Clara's furious stare. That's fraud, Ethan said quietly. Not just land scheming, not just hired violence. Fraud against a dying man against his daughter going back 2 years before any of this began. My father worked himself into an early grave trying to pay off a debt this man invented out of nothing, Clara said. And the words came out broken now, grief finally breaking through the fury that had carried her this far. He believed it was his own failure, Ethan. He died believing he'd failed to provide for me, when the whole time the numbers themselves were a lie. Ethan's hand found hers steady and warm, despite the chaos of the room around them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of that discovery settling over Clara heavier than any single night's exhaustion had managed to. We'll prove it, Ethan said finally. Every falsified entry, every inflated figure, we'll lay it out plain enough that no judge in this territory, bought or otherwise, can pretend not to see it. Dawn was fully breaking by the time Sheriff Cole had Hargrove and Dutch Corrigan both secured in the jailhouse, the satchel of cash and the incriminating ledger locked away as evidence. And Clara found herself standing on the jailhouse steps, with a strange, hollowed-out feeling, replacing the fury that had carried her through the night. Exhaustion and grief, and something like disbelief all tangled together in her chest. It's not finished, she said quietly, watching the sun climb fully over the ridge at last. Judge Prescott's still out there. Wendell Ashford at the land office. Whoever else Hargrove was paying to keep his scheme running smooth. No, Ethan agreed. It's not finished, but it's cracked wide open now, Clara, in a way it wasn't 12 hours ago. A confessed arsonist, a ledger showing fraud, a witness recovering if the doctors write well enough to eventually speak for himself. That's more than enough to bring the whole thing down, even on men who thought their money made them untouchable. They did not get the rest they both desperately needed. Within the hour, word had spread through Willow Creek faster than any fire, and by mid-morning, a crowd had gathered outside the jailhouse, drawn by rumors of the banker's arrest, and hungry for confirmation of what half the town had apparently suspected for longer than Clara had ever realized. She stood at the edge of that crowd, still in yesterday's soot-streaked dress, and listened as voices rose around her, in a chorus she had not expected to hear directed her way. Is it true? An older woman asked, pushing through toward Clara. That Hargrove cheated your father, that the debt was never what he claimed. It's true, Clara said, and her voice, though exhausted, carried clear across the gathered crowd. My father borrowed $200. The bank's own ledger shows it. Everything past that was invented, added slow enough that none of us noticed until it had already grown large enough to take everything he built. A murmur ran through the crowd, anger and vindication mixed together in equal measure, and Clara realized, standing there in the growing light of morning, that the story unfolding around her had stopped being only her own. The moment Hargrove's greed had reached past her bakery and into an old rancher's barn, into a ranch hand's skull, into a corrupt ledger that had likely swallowed more families than just the Whitmores over the years he'd been running his scheme. How many others? She asked Sheriff Cole later that morning, once the crowd had thinned and the jailhouse had returned to something resembling order. How many other families in this valley might be paying off debts he inflated the same way he inflated mine? Cole's expression turned grim. That's exactly what I intend to find out, Miss Whitmore, starting with every ledger in that bank going back as far as the records reach. If he did this to your father, I'd wager my badge he did it to others too proud or too frightened or too far behind to ever think to question the numbers a banker handed them. The answer came faster than any of them expected, and it came in a form none of them had anticipated. That same afternoon, as Clara finally allowed herself a few hours of desperately needed sleep in the back room of her own bakery, Odette woke her with news that sent her scrambling upright before she had fully returned to consciousness. "There's a line of people outside the sheriff's office?" Odette said, her voice tight with something between excitement and disbelief. "Farmers, ranchers, half the families in this valley, all of them come forward once word spread about your father's ledger. Seems near a dozen households are asking Cole to review their own notes against the bank's original agreements." Clara dressed hurriedly and made her way to the sheriff's office, and what she found there brought a lump to her throat she had not expected. A line stretched down the boardwalk and around the corner, families she recognized from years of selling them bread, some of whom had barely spoken 2 words to her since her father's funeral, now waiting patiently with their own worn loan papers clutched in work-roughened hands, hoping to learn whether they too had been quietly cheated by a man the whole town had once trusted, simply because he wore a fine suit and sat behind a large desk. "Miss Whitmore," one of the farmers said as she passed an older man named Silva she barely knew beyond nodding acquaintance at the mercantile. "If you hadn't stood up to him, none of us would have thought to look twice at our own numbers. You did this valley a service, whatever it cost you to do it." Clara did not know how to answer that, so she simply nodded, throat too tight for words, and continued toward the sheriff's office, where Ethan waited with an expression that mixed exhaustion and something that looked almost like pride. "You should see the tally so far," he said quietly. 7 families confirmed inflated notes already, and Cole's barely started working through the full ledger. This wasn't just your father, Clara. This was a system built slow and careful over years, squeezing this whole valley one family at a time, while everybody believed it was simply hard luck and hard times. "Then it needs to end today," Clara said. "Not just Hargrove sitting in a cell. The whole rotten structure of it torn out by the roots, so no other family in this valley ever wakes up to find their father's grave paid for by a lie they never had the numbers to catch." Walt approached them, then hat in hand, his weathered face carrying an expression Clara had not seen on him before, something almost hesitant beneath his usual steady confidence. "Miss Whitmore, there's something I ought to tell you, and I should have told you sooner, only I didn't understand the shape of it myself until I heard about your father's ledger." "What is it, Walt?" "My brother took a loan from that bank 6 years back before you were old enough to mind the books yourself," Walt said. "Lost his spread to foreclosure 2 years later, moved out east. Never spoke of it again on account of the shame he carried over losing land our family had worked 3 generations. I always thought it was bad luck, a hard winter, and a worse market. Never once thought to wonder if the numbers themselves had been dishonest." Clara felt something tighten in her chest at the raw grief still evident in the older man's voice. 6 years old, and clearly no less painful for the passage of time. "I'm sorry, Walt. If Cole finds anything in those old records, won't bring my brother's land back," Walt said, "and it's long past the point where any restitution could undo what it cost him. But it'll mean something knowing the truth of it finally, even 6 years late. And it means what you did these past 2 days wasn't just for your own bakery, Miss Whitmore. It was for every family this valley's lost to a lie dressed up as bad fortune." Clara did not trust her voice enough to answer that properly, so she simply reached out and pressed Walt's weathered hand between both of hers, and he nodded once, understanding conveyed without need for further words between them. It was Ethan who first noticed the rider approaching from the north road that evening, moving fast enough to draw attention even from a distance. And something in the set of the man's shoulders told Clara, even before he'd fully arrived, that the day was not yet finished handing out surprises. The rider proved to be a deputy from the neighboring county, breathless and travel-worn, carrying a telegram that Sheriff Cole read with an expression that shifted from confusion to alarm within the space of a single sentence. "Judge Prescott's fled," Cole said, folding the telegram slowly. "Left his chambers this afternoon, packed a bag, and rode out toward the territorial line before word of Hargrove's arrest had even fully spread past this county. Neighboring sheriff spotted him passing through. Thought it strange enough to wire ahead. He's running, Ethan said. Which means he knows exactly how deep this reaches, and he'd rather disappear than answer for his part in it. "A fleeing judge is as good as a confession in most territorial courts," Cole said grimly. "I'll wire the marshal myself tonight, get men posted at every crossing between here and the territorial line. A man running that hard doesn't get far without leaving a trail, and I intend to make certain he doesn't slip past us now. Not after everything this valley's already paid to bring this far into the light." "How long before your men can reach the crossings?" Ethan asked. "An hour, maybe less if I send them now instead of waiting on first light," Cole said. "But Prescott's had a head start already, and if he knows this country half as well as a man who's ridden circuit through it for a decade, he won't take the main road where my men are watching. He'll cut through the old mining trail past Miller's Pass, the one route nobody bothers guarding because it's near impassable after dark. Then that's exactly the route he'll take," Ethan said, counting on nobody thinking a man his age would risk that trail at night. "Cole, I know that pass. Rode it a dozen times hunting strays as a younger man. If we push hard, we can beat him to the Narrows before he ever clears the ridge." Clara felt something settle in her chest at that news. Not quite relief, not yet, but something close enough to it that her exhausted body finally allowed itself to feel the full weight of the 2 days behind her. She sank onto a bench outside the sheriff's office, and Ethan sat down beside her, without a word, close enough that his shoulder pressed lightly against hers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Simply breathing in the quiet of an evening that had, against every terrible odds of the previous night, somehow arrived at something resembling hope. Odette appeared beside them a moment later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She pressed into their hands without asking whether they wanted it, her own face still streaked faintly with soot from the fire hours earlier. "You two look like you've aged a decade since I saw you last night," she said, not unkindly. "Drink that. You'll need your strength if Cole's fixing to ride out again before dark." "You heard about Prescott," Clara said. "Whole town's heard by now," Odette said. "Half of Willow Creek's standing outside the Mercantile arguing over whether a judge fleeing town proves guilt plainer than a written confession would. For what it's worth, I think it does." "So do I," Clara said, managing a tired smile despite everything. "We're not finished yet," Ethan said, though something warm had crept into his voice that hadn't been there through the worst of the previous night. "But we're closer than either of us had any right to hope for 2 days back. And Clara, whatever comes next, whatever it takes to see Prescott caught, and this whole scheme laid bare in a proper courtroom, I don't intend to ride away from this valley once it's finished. Not now. Not after everything the last 2 days have shown me about the woman standing beside me through all of it." Clara turned to look at him, then really look, taking in the exhaustion etched into his face alongside something steadier and warmer underneath it. And she found herself for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely unafraid of whatever her own heart was trying to tell her in that quiet, dust-streaked evening. "I'm glad," she said softly, "that you didn't ride past my bakery that night." "So am I," Ethan said, and the smile that followed reached all the way into his tired eyes. "Though I'll admit, Miss Whitmore, I came for the bread, and I'm leaving with considerably more than I bargained for." Before Clara could answer, a shout rose up from the direction of the jailhouse, sharp and urgent enough to snap both of them back onto their feet, and Sheriff Cole came striding out with his face set hard as flint, calling for his deputies to mount up. "Prescott's been spotted," Cole said. "Crossing the ridge road not 3 miles out, and he's not alone. Got Wendell Ashford riding with him, and by the look of the wire they're making straight for the old mining pass, the one route out of this territory that doesn't cross a single checkpoint. We've got man tonight." Clara's stomach dropped at the news. The fragile hope of the last hour suddenly fracturing under the weight of a chase that had not yet finished playing out, and she watched Ethan's expression harden into the same fierce resolve she had first seen in him the night he'd knocked on her bakery door dust on his coat, and a purpose in his eyes that had already, in the space of 2 impossible days, changed the whole shape of her life. "Then we ride?" Ethan said, already moving toward his horse. "Because I did not spend 2 days helping tear this scheme into the light, only to watch the men behind it vanish over a ridgeline into a territory where nobody will ever find them again." Clara was on her feet before she had fully decided to be reaching for the spare horse, tethered outside the jailhouse, with a determination that left no room for anyone to suggest she stay behind. "I'm coming. Clara, this could turn dangerous fast," Ethan said, though he did not slow his own preparations, even as he said it, some part of him clearly already certain what her answer would be. Prescott's desperate men carry guns they don't always think twice about using. "I've spent 2 days proving I don't run from danger just because somebody thinks I ought to," Clara said, swinging up into the saddle with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "I'm not starting now, not when we're this close to finishing what we started." Sheriff Cole did not waste breath arguing, either already mounted and calling orders to his deputies, as the small posse formed in the gathering dusk. "Ridge Road cuts through Miller's Pass before it reaches the old mining trail," he said. "If we push hard, we can cut them off before they clear the pass and lose themselves in that broken country beyond it, where 100 men could hide and never be found." They rode hard through the falling light hooves pounding against packed earth, the wind tearing at Clara's hair and stinging her eyes until she could barely keep them open, and still she pushed her horse forward, matching pace with Ethan's, without ever once falling behind. The ridge road climbed steadily upward, switching back along the mountainside, and it was near the top of the final rise where the trail narrowed between 2 shoulders of broken rock that they finally spotted the 2 riders ahead, pushing their own mounts hard toward the pass beyond. "There," Ethan called, pointing toward the fleeing figures silhouetted against the darkening sky. "Prescott's on the gray Ashfords behind him on the bay." Sheriff Cole raised his voice to carry across the distance a lawman's command honed by years of practice. "Prescott Ashford, rein up in the name of the territorial court." The response came not in words, but in a sudden burst of speed from both fleeing riders, and Clara felt her heart lurch as Prescott's horse stumbled on the loose scree of the narrow trail, the judge nearly unseated, before he wrenched the animal back under control with a curse audible even at this distance. "He's going to run that horse right off the trail," Ethan shouted, urging his own mount faster. Cole cut left, tried to box them against the rock face before they reached the pass proper. The chase tightened as the trail narrowed, further rock walls rising close on either side, and Clara found herself gaining ground almost without meaning to. Her horse sure-footed on terrain she had no business navigating with the little riding experience she carried, driven forward by something fiercer than skill alone. She watched as Ethan drew nearly level with Ashford's bay, reaching out to grab for the reins, just as the land office clerk wheeled his horse hard to the side in a desperate attempt to break free of the pursuit. "Ashford, it's finished!" Ethan shouted over the pounding hooves and the wind. "Prescott's leaving you to answer for this alone. Look at him. He's not slowing for you." Ahead, Prescott's gray horse had indeed pulled further away, the judge apparently more concerned with his own escape than any loyalty owed to the clerk, who had falsified records on his behalf, and something in Ashford's face shifted at the sight of it. The particular betrayal of a man realizing in the middle of his own desperate flight that the powerful men he had served were entirely willing to abandon him the moment his usefulness ran out. "He said we'd both get clear," Ashford shouted back, though the fight had visibly begun to drain from his voice, even as his horse continued to labor beneath him. "Said the territory line was close enough, we'd both be free of this before anyone caught up." "Does that look like a man waiting on you?" Ethan called back, gesturing toward Prescott's retreating figure, and Ashford's shoulders sagged in the saddle at the plain, undeniable truth of it. "I'll stop," Ashford called, finally reining his horse down to a walk with the defeated posture of a man who had run out of reasons to keep running. "I'll stop, I swear it. Just don't let that posse shoot me down for a fool's errand I never should have agreed to." Ethan slowed alongside him, keeping a careful distance, but no longer pressing the pursuit, and one of Cole's deputies peeled off to take custody of the surrendering clerk, while the rest of the posse pushed on after Prescott, whose gray horse was beginning at last to show the strain of the hard climb. Clara pushed her own mount forward, drawing nearly level with Sheriff Cole, as they closed the gap on the fleeing judge, and she could see Prescott glancing back over his shoulder. Now panic plain on his face in the fading light, the calculated composure of a man who had sat comfortably on a bench for years, dissolving entirely under the simple, terrible pressure of being chased down by people he could no longer bribe or threaten into silence. "Judge Prescott," Cole shouted. "There's nowhere left to run. Ashford's already stopped. Hargrove's confessed man is sitting in my jail. Whatever you're hoping to reach past that pass, it isn't freedom anymore. It's just more running, and eventually a man runs out of country to run into." Prescott's horse stumbled again on the treacherous footing, and this time the animal went down hard, throwing the judge from the saddle with a cry that echoed off the rock walls surrounding them. Clara's breath caught as she watched him tumble across the trail, and for one terrible moment, she feared the fall might have killed him outright, ending any chance of the answers and accountability the whole valley had been fighting 2 days to secure. But Prescott stirred, groaning, clutching at an arm that hung wrong at his side, and by the time Cole reached him and hauled him upright with rough but careful hands, the judge had nothing left in him but a broken, defeated silence that spoke louder than any confession could have. "Get him back to town," Cole said to his deputies, his voice carrying none of the satisfaction Clara might have expected after such a chase, only the tired efficiency of a lawman finishing necessary work. "Doctor can set that arm once he's secured. I want him in a cell before this county has the chance to decide he deserves worse than a broken bone for what he's done." Clara sat astride her borrowed horse at the top of the pass, breathing hard, watching as the deputies loaded the injured judge onto a spare mount for the long ride back to Willow Creek, and felt the full weight of the 2 days finally begin to settle over her. All at once, a bone-deep exhaustion tangled together with something that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, but perhaps some new and unfamiliar mixture of both. "It's over," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone listening. "Isn't it? It's actually over." "The running's over," Ethan said, drawing his horse alongside hers at the crest of the pass, the last light of evening painting the broken country below them in shades of gold and deepening shadow. "The proving of it, the courtroom part, the reckoning for everyone this scheme ever touched that's still ahead of us. But the men who built it, Clara, they're not going anywhere tonight except into a cell, same as the fear they used to hold over this whole valley for longer than any of us realized." Clara looked out over the darkening landscape toward Willow Creek somewhere below, and beyond the ridge toward the bakery that had nearly been stolen from her not 2 days past, toward a town that had spent 6 months believing her too large, too slow, too unfit to keep what her father had built. And she felt something settle inside her chest that she recognized after a moment as something close to peace. "My father used to say the oven never lies," she said softly. "You put bread in, you get bread out, honest as anything in this world. I used to think that was just a baker's saying. I understand it different now. It wasn't about bread at all. It was about the truth always showing itself eventually, however long a lie manages to hide it." Ethan reached over in the gathering dark and took her hand, and Clara led him exhausted and aching and further from alone than she had felt in the 6 long months since her father's funeral. And together they turned their horses back down the mountain trail toward the valley below, toward a town that would wake tomorrow to find its banker in chains and its judge disgraced, and toward whatever reckoning still waited to be finished in the days that followed a night that had begun with nothing more than 48 loaves of bread and a debt that refused to be the end of anyone's story. The ride back down the mountain took the better part of 2 hours, and by the time Willow Creek's scattered lights came into view below them, Clara's whole body ached with an exhaustion so complete it had passed clean through pain and out the other side into something almost peaceful. Ethan rode close beside her the entire way, not speaking much, simply present in a way that Clara had come to understand over the span of 3 impossible days meant more than words ever could have. Sheriff Cole delivered Prescott to the jailhouse doctor, first the judge's broken arm set and splinted, while he sat in sullen, defeated silence, offering no further protest, no further threats about territorial connections or bought favors. Whatever fight had carried him through years of comfortable corruption had drained out of him somewhere on that mountain trail, and what remained looked to Clara's tired eyes like nothing more than a frightened old man finally facing the weight of everything he had built on other people's suffering. "He'll answer for it," Cole said, watching through the bars as the doctor finished his work. "Territorial marshals already been wired. Should have men here within 3 days to take custody of all 3 of them, Hargrove, Prescott, and Ashford both. There'll be a proper trial, Miss Whitmore, held in a courtroom far enough from this county that no local favors can twist the outcome. 3 days, Clara repeated, and something in the number settled over her strangely, both an eternity and no time at all after everything the valley had endured in the last 2. 3 days, Cole confirmed. Get some rest between now and then. You've more than earned it, and there's still testimony to give once the marshal arrives, questions to answer, evidence to hand over, proper and formal. I expect it'll be a long few weeks before this is fully settled in a courtroom, but the hardest part, the danger of it, that's behind you now. Clara wanted desperately to believe him, and for 2 days it seemed as though he might be right. The bakery reopened its doors to a town that greeted her with a warmth she had not known in the 6 months since her father's funeral. Customers lining up not out of pity or curiosity, but out of genuine gratitude. Several of them pressing extra coins into her hand that she tried and failed to refuse. Odette took to calling it the vindication rush. And though Clara laughed at the phrase, she could not deny that something fundamental had shifted in how Willow Creek looked at her, as though the truth about Hargrove's ledger had somehow also revealed the truth about everything else the town had misjudged. Ethan came by each morning under the pretense of collecting the ranch's weekly bread order, though both of them had long since stopped pretending the visits were purely business. He would linger past the loading of the wagon sitting at Clara's kitchen table while she finished her morning baking, and their conversations drifted slowly and without either of them quite noticing the shift from the practical matters of debt and testimony into something gentler, something that felt to Clara dangerously close to courtship. "You've got flour on your nose," Ethan told her on the 3rd morning, reaching across the table before he seemed to fully consider the gesture, brushing his thumb lightly against her cheek to wipe away a streak of white. Clara went still at the touch, more aware of her own heartbeat than she had been in longer than she cared to admit. "I always have flour somewhere on me. Occupational hazard. I've noticed," Ethan said, and something in his voice had gone soft in a way that made Clara's breath catch. "Can't say I mind it much." On the 4th morning, Tobias arrived early to help with deliveries, and the boy watched the easy warmth between Clara and Ethan with the shrewd, unembarrassed curiosity that only a 12-year-old could manage. "Are you two courting?" he asked bluntly, hauling a sack of flour toward the counter, as though the question required no more delicacy than commenting on the weather. Clara felt heat rush to her face. "Tobias, that's hardly a proper question to. Reckon we might be at that," Ethan said, entirely unbothered, a grin spreading across his face at Clara's flustered silence. "Would that trouble you any, son?" Tobias considered the matter with great seriousness. "Suppose not long as you keep buying Miss Whitmore's bread regular. Wouldn't want her business to suffer on account of romance distracting either of you from important things." "A fair condition," Ethan said solemnly, though his eyes danced with barely contained laughter as he glanced toward Clara, who had given up trying to hide her own smile entirely. Before either of them could say more, a sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment, and Clara opened it to find Sheriff Cole standing there, with an expression that immediately drained the warmth from the room. "Marshall's train got delayed," Cole said without preamble. "Washout on the line east of here won't be repaired for the better part of a week, and in the meantime, I've had word that Hargrove's hired a lawyer out of Denver, a slick one by reputation, arriving tomorrow to argue for bail pending trial." "Bail?" Clara's voice rose sharply. The man tried to have a witness burned alive in his own barn. Surely no judge would grant him bail. "Surely," Cole agreed grimly, "except the only judge presiding in this county until the marshal arrives with someone properly appointed is Prescott's own clerk, a man named Foster, who served under him for 6 years and owes his position entirely to the judge's favor. I don't trust Foster's independence any further than I could throw him, and neither, I suspect, should you." Clara felt the fragile peace of the last 2 days crack wide open at that news. If Hargrove makes bail, what's to stop him from running, same as Prescott tried to? "Nothing," Cole admitted. "Nothing at all, except whatever bail's set high enough to make running costly, and a man with a satchel of cash and Denver connections doesn't find high bail much of an obstacle." Ethan had risen from the table, his expression hardening into the same focused resolve Clara had come to recognize as the shape he wore when a problem demanded action rather than worry. Then we need to make sure Foster understands exactly how much scrutiny he'll face if he grants bail to a man half this valley watched get arrested for arson and fraud both. How do you propose we do that? Cole asked. The same way we've done everything else these past 3 days, Ethan said. Plainly, and in front of enough witnesses that quiet corruption becomes considerably harder to manage. The bail hearing, when it convened the following afternoon in the small county courthouse, drew a crowd larger than Clara had ever seen gathered in Willow Creek for any single occasion. Farmers and ranchers and shopkeepers packed shoulder to shoulder along the back wall and spilling out through the open doors into the street beyond. Word had spread fast that the corrupt banker was seeking release, and the valley he had cheated for years had turned out in force to make certain the proceedings unfolded under as many watchful eyes as the small courthouse could hold. Hargrove's lawyer, a sharply dressed man named Whitfield, who spoke with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to courtrooms far grander than this one, made his argument with practiced ease. Your Honor, my client is a respected businessman with deep roots in this community. The charges against him remain unproven, resting largely on the testimony of a confessed criminal seeking leniency for his own crimes. I ask that reasonable bail be set pending a proper trial before a properly appointed judge. Clerk Foster, seated uncomfortably behind the bench in a role he had clearly never expected to occupy, shuffled his papers with visibly nervous hands. The court will consider... Your Honor, Clara said, rising from her seat before she had fully decided to speak, her voice carrying clear across the crowded room despite her own racing heart. If I might address the court. Foster hesitated, glancing toward Whitfield as though seeking permission from the wrong party entirely, before finally nodding his assent. Briefly, Miss Whitmore. This man, Clara said, turning to face the gathered crowd rather than the bench, inflated my father's loan by $80 he never borrowed, then let 2 years of interest turn that lie into a debt large enough to bankrupt our family. When I confronted him about a scheme to steal my land through a manufactured debt, he hired men to burn down a barn with an unconscious witness inside it, a man who survives today only because half this valley formed a bucket line to save him. If this court believes bail is appropriate for a man capable of that, I would ask every family in this room, whose own notes are still being reviewed by Sheriff Cole, to consider what message that sends about whose safety this courthouse actually protects. A murmur swept through the crowd, low and dangerous, the sound of a community's patience stretched thin enough to hear its own fraying. Foster's eyes darted across the packed room, taking in faces that Clara suspected he recognized as neighbors' customers, people whose good opinion he would need long after this hearing concluded, regardless of what favor he owed Prescott. The court, Foster said finally, his voice noticeably less steady than it had been moments before, finds the risk of flight, given the severity of the charges and the defendant's evident resources, too significant to justify bail at this time. The defendant will remain in custody pending the arrival of the territorial marshal. Whitfield's composure flickered, but he said nothing further, apparently recognizing, as Clara had hoped he would, that a courtroom packed with angry witnesses was no place to press a losing argument. Hargrove himself, seated at the defense table in his manacles, stared at Clara with an expression she could not fully read. Something between hatred and grudging bitter respect. You've made an enemy for life, Miss Whitmore, he said quietly, as the deputies moved to escort him back to his cell, his voice pitched low enough that only she and Ethan standing close beside her could hear it. I made an enemy the night you decided my father's grief was an opportunity, Clara said. I'd rather have made that enemy honestly than kept your friendship built on a lie. That evening, as the crowd slowly dispersed from the courthouse steps, Clara found herself approached by a woman she barely recognized, thin and careworn, clutching a folded paper against her chest, with the particular desperation of someone who had waited a long time to speak a truth aloud. Miss Whitmore, the woman said, my name is Ruth Adler. My husband and I lost our farm to the bank 4 years back. Everyone said it was the drought that ruined us. I always believed that until I heard what happened with your father's note. Clara's chest tightened at the raw hope threading through the woman's voice. "Mrs. Adler, I'm so sorry for what you've lost." "I don't need sympathy," Ruth said, though her voice trembled slightly. "I need to know if Sheriff Cole would look at our old papers, same as he looked at yours. My husband's gone now past 2 winters back from the grief of it more than anything else. But if that debt was a lie too, I want it known. For his memory, if nothing else. I'll walk you to Cole's office myself," Clara said, and she did. And by the time she returned home that night, 3 more families had come forward with similar stories, each one a small, quiet tragedy that had been quietly filed away under the heading of bad luck and hard times, never once suspected as anything other than the ordinary cruelty of frontier life. The days that followed passed in a strange rhythm of ordinary labor and extraordinary reckoning. Clara baking each morning, while Sheriff Cole worked steadily through the bank's ledgers, uncovering fraud after fraud that had touched families throughout the valley for years longer than anyone had suspected. Walt's brother's old debt was confirmed, inflated same as Clara's father's, and 3 other families came forward with similar discoveries. Their own notes bearing the same telltale pattern of small compounding lies that had grown over time into debts large enough to strip them of land and livelihood. 9 families confirmed now, Cole told Clara and Ethan one evening, spreading the ledger pages across Clara's kitchen table. 9, and I've still got 3 years of records left to review. I'd wager the final count reaches 15 before I'm through, maybe more. What happens to them? Clara asked. The families who already lost their land because of it. That's where it gets complicated, Cole admitted. The bank itself, under new management, once this is finished, will likely be required to make restitution, but land already sold to third parties, that's harder to unwind. Some families may get money back. Others may only get the truth, and I know that's a poor substitute for a home. It's not nothing, Ethan said quietly. Truth's worth something, even when it can't undo what's already been lost. Ask Walt. Ask any man who's spent years believing his own failure cost him everything, only to learn the ground was rigged against him from the start. Clara thought of her father. Then of the 6 months she had spent believing his death had come from a heart simply worn out by ordinary hardship. And she felt the old grief shift into something new. Not lighter exactly, but clearer. Less tangled with the guilt she had carried since his funeral. He had not failed. He had been robbed slowly and quietly by a man who wore fine suits and spoke in polite, measured tones, and knowing that truth did not bring him back, but it did at last let her set down a burden of shame that had never rightfully belonged to her family at all. Walt himself came by the bakery not long after his own brother's confirmed fraud finally logged in the Oversight Committee's growing ledger of restitution. He stood in the doorway a long moment before speaking, hat turned over slowly in his weathered hands. "Wrote to my brother out east," he said finally. "Told him what the ledger showed. Took me 3 tries to get the words right on account of not wanting to reopen a wound that never rightly healed to begin with." "What did he say?" Clara asked gently. "Wrote back faster than I expected." Walt said something thick in his voice. Said it was the first time in 6 years he'd slept a full night through. Said knowing the truth of it, even now, even too late to get the land back, felt like being handed his own name, returned to him clean. He cleared his throat visibly, working to steady himself. "Wanted you to know that Miss Whitmore. Wanted you to know what it meant clear on the other side of the country to a man who never even met you." Clara found she could not answer that with words at all, and simply embraced the old rancher instead, grateful beyond speaking for a friendship that had begun improbably with a midnight ride to a neighbor's barn and had grown into something that reached. It seemed far beyond the valley she called home. It was during this same restless week of waiting that Clara received an unexpected visitor at the bakery, a stern-looking man in a city suit who introduced himself as Bartholomew Reese, a representative of the bank's Regional Oversight Board, sent to assess the institution's future following Hargrove's arrest. He studied Clara across her own counter with an appraising look that reminded her uncomfortably of the way Hargrove himself had once looked at her, weighing her size and her gender before ever considering her words. "Miss Whitmore," Reese said, The board finds itself in an unusual position. The bank cannot simply close its doors as this valley depends upon it for commerce. Yet public confidence has been thoroughly shattered by recent events. We are considering candidates to serve on a newly formed oversight committee. Local citizens whose integrity might help restore that confidence. Your name has been mentioned. Clara blinked, genuinely startled. Mr. Reese, I bake bread. I have no experience managing a bank's affairs. You have something considerably more valuable than experience, Reese said. You have the trust of this entire valley earned through the hardest possible means. The board believes your presence on such a committee would mean more to public confidence than any credentialed banker we might import from Denver. Clara did not answer immediately, turning the offer over in her mind with the same careful attention she gave to a difficult recipe, weighing what it might cost her against what it might allow her to protect. If I accept, she said finally, I want assurance that every family. Sheriff Cole confirms as defrauded, receives fair restitution, not delayed by paperwork or buried under bureaucratic excuses. I've seen enough of this valley's families suffer under numbers they couldn't verify. I won't lend my name to an institution that continues that suffering under a friendlier face. That assurance I believe I can provide. Reese said something like genuine respect entering his voice for the first time since he'd walked through her door. The board is eager to demonstrate reform, Miss Whitmore, and eager to avoid the scrutiny that further scandal would invite. Your conditions align, I think, rather neatly with our own interests. Then I accept, Clara said, provisionally, until I see that alignment proven in practice, rather than merely promised in conversation. Ethan, who had been quietly loading the week's bread order during this exchange, could not quite hide his smile once Reese had departed. From baker to bank overseer in the span of 1 month. Your father would hardly recognize the woman standing in this kitchen. My father would recognize exactly this woman, Clara said. He always said I had his head for numbers, and my mother's stubbornness for everything else. Seems both are finally being put to proper use. 2 weeks into her new role on the Oversight Committee, Clara found herself present in Sheriff Cole's office the day Ruth Adler returned to learn what the reviewed ledgers had revealed about her late husband's farm. The widow stood clutching her shawl with white-knuckled hands, bracing herself. Clara suspected for one more disappointment in a life that had already handed her more than its fair share. Mrs. Adler, Cole said gently, the ledger confirms it. Your husband's note was inflated by $62 over what he actually borrowed, same pattern as Miss Whitmore's father, and 11 other families now confirmed. The Oversight Committee has approved restitution in the amount of the fraud plus accumulated interest wrongly charged against it. Ruth's composed expression finally cracked, tears spilling freely down her weathered cheeks. It wasn't the drought at all. Not really. It was never really the drought. The drought made things harder, Clara said gently, crossing the room to take the older woman's hands in her own. But it wasn't what cost you your farm, Mrs. Adler. A man's greed did that dressed up to look like bad luck so nobody would think to question it. I wish my husband had lived to hear this, Ruth said softly. He carried that shame to his grave, believing he'd failed us both. Then let his memory carry the truth instead, Clara said. That's not nothing even now. That's everything as far as I've come to understand it. The territorial marshal arrived 6 days later than originally planned, a weathered, no-nonsense man named Marshal Hutchins, who took one look at the accumulated evidence. Dutch Corrigan's signed confession, the falsified ledger entries, the boot prints, and kerosene tin recovered from the Pruitt barn, and declared the case among the most thoroughly documented instances of banking fraud and attempted murder he had encountered in 15 years of territorial service. You built quite a case here, Sheriff, Hutchins said, reviewing the stacked evidence in Cole's office. Confessed accomplice, physical evidence, documented financial fraud spanning years, and a fled judge caught in the act of running. I don't expect the prosecution will need more than a week to secure convictions on all 3 men. And Amos Pruitt, Clara asked. Will he be well enough to testify? Doctor says he's finally waking clear-headed, Cole said. Confused about the days right around the accident, understandable given the injury, but lucid enough now to confirm the offer Hargrove's clerk made him for the land. That, combined with everything else, should be more than sufficient. 2 days before the party was set to depart for the territorial capital, a fresh complication arrived in the form of an anonymous letter delivered to Clara's bakery door unsigned and written in a hand disguised enough that no one could immediately place it. The message was brief and unmistakably threatening. "Withdraw your testimony, or lose more than a bakery this time." Clara's hands trembled as she read it, less from fear than from a fury she thought she had already spent entirely on Hargrove weeks before. She brought it straight to Sheriff Cole, who examined the paper with a grim, considering frown. "Could be a bluff," Cole said. "Man behind bars awaiting trial hasn't got much reach left to make good on threats. But it could also mean he's got someone still loyal on the outside, someone who hasn't yet been caught up in the arrests." "Silas Reed," Ethan said immediately. He ran before any of this started, before Hargrove's arrest, before Dutch's confession. If anyone's still free to make good on a threat like this, it's him. Cole doubled the guard posted outside the bakery that night and sent word to increase security around every witness scheduled to testify. And though the days leading up to the trial passed without further incident, Clara found herself sleeping poorly, waking at every unfamiliar sound. Ethan's presence in the kitchen each morning, offering the only real comfort against a fear she refused to let stop her from testifying, regardless of what it cost. Odette took to sleeping in the bakery's back room those final nights before departure, insisting she would rather share a cramped cot than leave Clara alone with a threat still hanging unresolved. "Your father would skin me alive if I let anything happen to you now," she said, settling a quilt over the narrow cot with brisk, no-nonsense efficiency. "After everything the two of us have already survived together this past month." "I'm not made of glass, Odette." "Never said you were," Odette replied. "Said I'd rather sleep poorly beside a friend than sleep easy alone knowing she might need me in the night." "That's not pity, Clara. That's just what friends do for each other when the world's given them good reason to watch each other's backs." "I'm not withdrawing," she told Ethan on the morning they were set to leave for the capital, her voice steady despite the sleepless shadows beneath her eyes. "Whoever wrote that letter wanted me frightened into silence. I won't give them the satisfaction." "I never doubted you wouldn't," Ethan said. "But I'll be riding beside that wagon the whole way there and the whole way back, and I'll be sitting in that gallery every single day of the trial, and if Silas Reed or anyone else thinks they'll get close enough to make good on a threat, they'll have to get past me first." Odette pressed a small parcel into Clara's hands before the wagon departed, wrapped tight in cloth still warm from the morning's baking. "Bread for the road," she said simply. "Your father always said a full stomach steadies a nervous heart better than any amount of talking ever could. Figured you could use the steadying wherever this trial takes you." Clara tucked the parcel carefully beside her on the wagon seat, more moved by the small gesture than she quite had words to express, and found as the wagon rolled out of Willow Creek toward the long road to the territorial capital that some of the fear knotted tight in her chest. These past several days had eased, if only slightly, at the simple knowledge of how thoroughly this town had wrapped itself around her in the week since that first terrible midnight. The trial, when it finally convened 3 weeks later in the territorial capital, drew witnesses from across the valley. Clara among them, called to testify to the inflated debt and the events of that first terrible night. She stood in the witness box, with her hands folded tightly in front of her, aware of Ethan's steady presence in the gallery, aware of Odette and Walt and Tobias seated beside him, aware of Amos Pruitt, himself weakened, but present, wrapped in blankets in a chair near the front of the courtroom, having insisted, despite his doctor's protests, that he would see this through to the end. "Miss Whitmore," the prosecutor asked, "can you describe in your own words the events of the night your father's note was called due?" Clara told it plainly, without embellishment. The foreclosure notice burned in her father's oven, the 48 loaves baked through a sleepless night, the debt she had believed until that very night was simply the unfortunate consequence of hard times rather than deliberate fraud. She told of Ethan's arrival, of the discovery of the inflated loan, of the flour theft, and the fence cutting, and the fire that had nearly claimed Amos Pruitt's life. The courtroom listened in a silence so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears throughout the whole account. Whitfield, still representing Hargrove despite the mounting evidence against his client, attempted a cross-examination clearly intended to paint Clara's testimony as embellished by personal grievance. Miss Whitmore, is it not true that you had every financial incentive to exaggerate the extent of any wrongdoing by my client, given that your own debt was thereby forgiven? The debt was paid in full before any of this came to light, Clara said evenly. Every dollar of it plus a dollar besides counted by Sheriff Cole himself the same night. I have no financial stake in Mr. Hargrove's conviction beyond the same stake every family in that valley has, which is knowing whether the numbers a banker hands them can be trusted, or whether they're simply another tool for men like your client to take what was never rightfully theirs. Whitfield had no effective response to that, and the judge, a stern, unaffiliated territorial jurist with no connection to Prescott's corrupted local bench, allowed the answer to stand without objection. Clara stepped down from the witness box on legs that trembled slightly with released tension, and Ethan caught her hand the moment she reached the gallery, squeezing it once firm and warm, a silent acknowledgement of exactly how much courage that testimony had required. The trial lasted 4 days in total, and by the end of it, the weight of evidence had grown too large for even Whitfield's considerable skill to overcome. Dutch Corrigan's confession held firm under cross-examination. Amos Pruitt, though visibly frail, testified with clear-eyed conviction about the bribe offer that had started the whole scheme unraveling. The falsified ledger entries, presented one after another by Sheriff Cole, painted an unmistakable pattern of fraud stretching back years, touching family after family throughout the valley. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with convictions on every count against all 3 men. Hargrove received 15 years for fraud conspiracy and accessory to attempted murder. Prescott, whose betrayal of judicial trust the judge condemned in scathing terms during sentencing, received 20 years, the additional weight reflecting the particular cruelty of a man sworn to uphold justice, choosing instead to sell it. Ashford, whose cooperation and surrender had earned some measure of leniency, received 5 years for his role in falsifying land records. Clara sat in the gallery as the verdicts were read, Ethan's hand still holding hers, and felt something inside her chest finally fully release. 6 months of grief and fear and lonely determination, settling at last into something she recognized with something like wonder as peace. It's finished, she whispered more to herself than to Ethan, though he heard her all the same. It's finished, he agreed softly. Your father's name is Clear Clara. Clear and vindicated in front of a whole courtroom for the whole territory to know. Outside the courthouse, as the crowd of valley witnesses gathered themselves for the long journey home, Marshal Hutchins approached Clara with news that settled the last of her lingering fears. We picked up Silas Reed 2 days ago, ma'am, trying to cross into the neighboring territory under a false name. He'll answer for the threatening letter along with everything else once we've finished sorting through what he knows. You and every other witness in this case can rest easy now. There's no one left free to make good on any threat against you. Relief washed through Clara so completely that her knees nearly buckled beneath her, and Ethan's arm came around her shoulders without hesitation, steady and sure, holding her upright through the last wave of fear, finally draining out of a body that had carried it unacknowledged for weeks. You never told me how frightened you really were, Ethan said quietly, once Hutchins had moved on to other business. I didn't want you to see it, Clara admitted. I've spent 6 months being seen as fragile by this whole town. I couldn't bear for you to see me that way too, not after everything. Clara, Ethan said, tilting her chin gently upward until she met his eyes. Fear isn't the same as fragility. I've watched you ride into danger, testify in front of a room full of strangers, and stand up to a corrupt judge with nothing but your own 2 hands and a stubborn refusal to back down. Being frightened and still doing all of that anyway, that's not weakness. That's about the bravest thing I've ever witnessed in another person. Clara felt her eyes sting with tears she no longer had any interest in hiding. And for a long moment, standing outside a courthouse in a strange city, with the whole valley's future finally set right behind them, she simply let herself be held. Amos Pruitt approached them slowly, still leaning on a cane. The doctor insisted he would need for some months. Yet his weathered face carrying an expression of hard-won gratitude that needed no elaborate words to convey its weight. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mrs. Calder tells me you visited nearly every day I lay unconscious, though I couldn't thank you for it properly till now." "You'd have done the same for me, Mr. Pruitt," Clara said. "Walt always said you two went back further than either of you had gray in your beards." "Further than that?" Amos said, a faint smile crossing his tired face. "Your father used to bring me bread on credit some winters back before you were old enough to help him in that kitchen. Said a neighbor's hunger wasn't a debt worth collecting on. Seems his daughter learned that lesson better than most." Clara found herself unable to answer that without her voice breaking, so she simply took the old rancher's weathered hand in both of hers, the same gesture she had offered Walt weeks before, and let the silence between them say what words could not quite manage. They rode back to Willow Creek together in a wagon crowded with the valley's other witnesses. The mood among them, lighter than Clara had felt in longer than she could remember conversation, and even occasional laughter filling the long journey home in a way that would have seemed impossible only weeks before. Odette sat beside her, chattering about the changes already underway at the bank under its newly appointed honest management, about the restitution proceedings beginning for the defrauded families, about a dozen small pieces of good news that Clara found herself almost too exhausted with relief to fully absorb. It was near dusk when they finally arrived back in Willow Creek, and the whole town, it seemed, had gathered outside the bakery to greet them. Word of the verdicts having traveled ahead by telegraph faster than any wagon could carry it. Clara stepped down into a crowd of familiar faces, shopkeepers and farmers and ranch hands, all of them calling out congratulations, several of the older women embracing her with a warmth that would have seemed unthinkable 6 months earlier, when she had walked these same streets believing herself invisible, except as an object of pity or doubt. "Your father would be so proud," Mrs. Finch said, pressing Clara's hands between her own weathered palms. "Not just for winning, dear. For never once giving up even when the whole town gave you every reason to." Clara found her voice tight with emotion she no longer bothered to hide. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch. That means more than I can properly say." As the crowd slowly began to disperse into the gathering evening, drifting home to their own suppers and their own long-delayed relief, Ethan lingered near the bakery door, and Clara found herself suddenly acutely aware of the quiet settling between them, the first real stillness either of them had known in the whole exhausting, transformative month since he had first knocked on her door in search of bread for his hungry crew. "I should let you rest," Ethan said, though he made no move to leave. "You've earned about a month's worth of uninterrupted sleep, by my reckoning." "Probably," Clara agreed, though she made no move to send him away either. "Ethan, I don't quite know how to thank you properly for everything you've done these past weeks. You could have ridden home with your bread that first night and never looked back, and instead you gave up weeks of your own life to see justice done for a woman you'd known less than an hour." "I didn't do it for thanks," Ethan said, echoing, whether he realized it or not, the very words he'd spoken to her that first midnight. "I did it because it needed doing, and because somewhere in the middle of doing it, I stopped thinking of it as your fight I was helping with and started thinking of it as something we were building together." Clara's breath caught at the quiet certainty in his voice, at the way he was looking at her now, steady and unguarded in a manner that left no room to mistake his meaning. "What are we building, Ethan?" "I don't rightly know yet." He admitted, a faint, almost boyish smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, despite the weight of everything they had just endured together. "But I know I don't want to find out from 2 hours away at Widow's Ridge, wondering how you're getting on without me riding into town every week under the excuse of collecting bread." "Then don't," Clara said, surprising herself with the boldness of it, though after everything the last month had demanded of her, boldness had come to feel less like recklessness and more like simple honesty. "Stay a while longer. See what we're building before you go deciding you already know the shape of it." Ethan reached up and gently brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his hand lingering against her cheek in a gesture far more tender than the flower wiping of weeks earlier. And Clara did not pull away, did not want to pull away. Standing there in the deepening dusk outside her father's bakery, with a man who had ridden into her darkest night and refused to ride back out of her life since. "I intend to," he said softly, "for as long as you'll have me, Clara Whitmore." "That could be a very long while." Clara said, her voice unsteady with something that felt remarkably like joy. I should warn you now before you commit yourself any further. I don't intend to stop running this bakery oversight committee or no oversight committee. Whatever we're building, it'll have to be built around 48 loaves and an oven that doesn't care much for anyone's romantic timeline. Wouldn't want it any other way. Ethan said, laughter warming his voice, even as his eyes stayed steady on hers. A man who fell for a woman baking through the night to save everything she loved has no business asking her to stop being exactly that woman once the danger's passed. Careful, Mr. Calloway, Clara said, though she was smiling now, wide and unguarded, in a way she could not remember managing in longer than she cared to count. A man could talk himself into all sorts of trouble saying things like that to a woman who still has an oven fire burning and half a mind to put him to work loading bread if he lingers much longer. Then put me to work, Ethan said, already rolling up his sleeves with an easy grin. I've never once minded earning my place at your table, Clara. Reckon I'd rather earn it than have it handed to me for free. Together they carried the evening's last loaves out to his waiting wagon, moving with the same easy rhythm they had first found that midnight weeks ago. Though everything about it now felt different. Lighter, carrying none of the desperation that had marked their first night working side by side. Odette watched from the doorway with poorly concealed delight, and somewhere down the street, Clara could hear Tobias's excited voice recounting the courtroom verdict to a cluster of other children who had gathered to hear the story. Second-hand embellishing details with the enthusiastic liberty only a 12-year-old storyteller could manage. Careful with that one, Tobias, Clara called out, laughing despite herself. I heard Prescott grow an extra foot taller in your last telling. Makes for a better story, Miss Whitmore, Tobias called back, entirely unrepentant, and the whole street seemed to ring with the easy, ordinary sound of a town settling back into itself whole and honest in a way it had not been in longer than anyone could quite remember. Behind them, through the bakery's lit window, the ordinary sounds of Willow Creek settling into evening wrapped around them both like something warm and familiar. A town finally at peace with itself after a season of hidden cruelty had at last been dragged into the light, where it could do no further harm. Autumn came to Willow Creek with a gold that Clara had never quite noticed before that year. The cottonwoods along the creek turning bright as fresh butter, the air carrying the first honest chill of the season through the open bakery door each morning. 6 months had passed since the trial. 6 months that had reshaped the valley in ways Clara still found herself marveling at some morning standing at her counter with flour on her hands and a peace in her chest that had once felt entirely foreign to her. The bank operated now under Reese's promised reforms. Restitution paid out to 14 confirmed families, Ruth Adler chief among them, who had used her returned money to buy back a modest parcel of her old farm and was by all accounts finally sleeping through the night. Amos Pruitt had recovered well enough to walk without his cane most days, though he still favored Walt's company over most. The two old friends spending long afternoons on Amos's porch, trading stories that had, over the months, grown steadily taller in the telling. Clara stood behind her counter, one crisp October morning, kneading dough with the same steady rhythm her father had taught her as a girl, when Ethan came through the door earlier than his usual delivery hour, still dusty from the ride, but carrying himself with a nervous energy that immediately caught her attention. "You're early," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Bread's not even out of the oven yet." "Didn't come for bread," Ethan said, and something in his voice made Clara set down her work entirely, giving him her full attention. "Came because I've been circling around something for weeks now, and I'm done circling." Clara's heart began to pound in a way that had nothing to do with the oven's heat. "Ethan." He crossed the kitchen to stand before her, dust and all, and reached into his coat pocket with hands that for the first time since she'd known him trembled slightly. "I've built a life out of knowing what I want the moment I see it, Clara. Knew it about ranching before I was old enough to shave proper. Knew it about this valley the first season I ran cattle through it. And I knew it about you the night you told me 48 loaves standing in this very kitchen with flour on your dress and more courage in you than any person I'd ever met. Ethan, what are you? I'm asking you to marry me." He said the words coming out plain and unpolished, exactly the way Clara had come to treasure everything about him. "Not because you need saving," because you've made abundantly clear these past months you never needed that from anyone. I'm asking because I don't want to spend one more sunrise wondering what it would be like to wake up already knowing you're there." Clara stared at him at the small ring he held out in his open palm, simple and unpretentious, and felt 6 months of steadily building certainty finally crest into something she no longer had any reason to hold back. "You rode into my bakery at midnight and bought every loaf of bread I had." "I did." "And you stayed," Clara said, her voice breaking with joy. She made no effort to hide. "Through fire and threats and a courtroom full of strangers you stayed." "I intend to keep staying," Ethan said, "for however many sunrises you'll let me." Behind them, unnoticed until that very moment, Tobias had wandered in through the back door in search of his usual morning bread, and now stood frozen in the doorway, eyes wide, clearly torn between the urge to announce himself and the instinct that he had stumbled upon something too important to interrupt. "Well?" the boy finally blurted, unable to contain himself a moment longer. "Are you gonna answer him or not? Miss Whitmore man's kneeling on a flour-dusted floor. Least you could do is put him out of his misery." Clara laughed, despite the tears already gathering in her eyes, the sound startled out of her by the boy's blunt impatience. "Then yes," she said, turning back to Ethan, and the word came out clear and certain, carrying none of the fear or doubt that had once made her believe love was a thing reserved for other smaller women than herself. "Yes, Ethan Calloway, 1,000 times yes. Isimigi." Tobias let out a whoop, loud enough to rattle the front windows, already sprinting back out the door to spread the news through Willow Creek faster than any telegraph line could manage. And Ethan rose to his feet laughing, pulling Clara into an embrace that lifted her clean off the ground. Both of them dissolving into the kind of joyful, disbelieving laughter that 6 months earlier neither could have imagined surviving long enough to feel. The wedding took place in early December, held not in a grand church, but in the bakery itself, warmed by the same stone oven her father had built with his own hands. The whole town of Willow Creek packed shoulder to shoulder around tables laden with more bread than even Clara's ovens had ever produced in a single day. Odette stood as her witnessed tears streaming freely down her face throughout the entire ceremony. Walt gave Clara away, since she had no father left to do it, and he did so with a gruff pride that left no doubt how thoroughly the old rancher had come to think of her as family. Tobias, now 13 and considerably taller than the boy who had first burst through her door with news of the flour theft, served as ring-bearer with a solemnity that made the whole congregation smile. "You look nervous, Walt," Clara whispered as they waited for the ceremony to begin, watching him fuss with his unfamiliar collar for the 3rd time. "Never walked a bride down an aisle before," Walt admitted. "Reckon I'm more nervous than the groom standing up there waiting on you." "You'll do just fine," Clara said, squeezing his weathered hand. "You've done harder things than this for me already. None of them mattered near as much." Walt said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. "Your father would be prouder of you today than any day I ever knew him, and I knew him a long while." Clara felt her own eyes sting at that, and she pressed a quick kiss to the old rancher's weathered cheek before the music began, before Walt led her forward through a crowd of faces that had once doubted her, and now stood united in genuine, unreserved joy. Amos Pruitt, standing steady now, without his cane, offered the toast that Clara would remember for the rest of her days. "I've lived a long while in this valley," he said, raising his glass with a hand that trembled only slightly from age rather than injury. "Seen good years and hard ones, honest men and crooked ones, and precious few moments where I felt certain the world had righted itself the way it ought to. This is one of them." To Clara and Ethan, who taught this whole valley that the truth always finds its way into the light, however long a lie manages to hide it. Clara looked out of the gathered faces at Ruth Adler standing beside her restored land deed, framed proudly on her parlor wall, at families whose stolen truth had finally been returned to them, at a town that had once dismissed her as too large, too slow, too unfit to keep what her father built, now standing together to celebrate everything she had built instead. She thought of her father, of the oven that never lied, of the 6 months of grief she had carried alone, before a stranger's knock at midnight had changed the whole shape of her life. "To my father," she said quietly, raising her own glass toward the stone oven glowing warm behind her, "who taught me that a bakery isn't about the bread. It's about being the one thing in this town that doesn't ever run out." Ethan took her hand, then in front of the whole gathered town, and Clara felt for the first time since her father's funeral entirely and completely whole. Spring came early the following year, and with it the Whitmore Calloway Bakery, as the townsfolk had taken to calling it, expanded its ovens to meet the demand of a valley finally recovering from years of quiet theft it had never known to name. Clara trained 2 young apprentices that seasoned girls from families the bank had once defrauded, teaching them not just the craft of bread, but the deeper lesson her father had given her. That honest work done with your own 2 hands could never truly be taken from you, no matter how many powerful men tried. Cornelius Hargrove remained in the territorial prison, his name spoken in Willow Creek, now only as a cautionary tale for children learning arithmetic, a lesson in what happens when numbers are trusted blindly instead of verified with care. Judge Prescott's disgrace had reached every corner of the territory, his name struck from the bench permanently. His betrayal remembered as the moment an entire county learned that justice required constant vigilance rather than quiet faith. Silas Reed. Clara learned that Spring had been sentenced in a neighboring territory for the threatening letter and his role in the wider scheme, his testimony against the syndicate that had employed him, bringing down 2 more corrupt land agents in counties well beyond Willow Creek's borders. Sheriff Cole liked to say the whole rotten business had finally been dug out, root and branch, and Clara found standing behind her counter each morning with nothing left to fear from the shadows of that first terrible midnight that she believed him completely. And Clara Whitmore now. Clara Calloway stood each morning in the bakery her father had built, working the same stone oven that had once been the last thing standing between her and ruin. No longer alone, no longer doubted, no longer anything less than exactly who she had always been, capable, determined, and utterly unbreakable. She had baked through the darkest night of her life, believing she might lose everything by sunrise. Instead, she had found a town that finally saw her clearly, a justice that finally reached the men who thought themselves untouchable, and a love that had ridden in out of the dark, asking nothing more than how many loaves she had left to give. Some nights when the bakery had gone quiet and Ethan was already asleep upstairs, Clara would stand alone by the stone oven her father built, resting her palm flat against its warm surface, the way she had every night since his funeral, and she would tell him in the quiet only the 2 of them had ever shared that she had kept his promise. The bakery had not run out. Not that terrible night, and not any night since. The answer Clara understood now, standing in the golden light of a Colorado morning, with her husband's hand in hers, and her father's legacy thriving all around her, had never really been about the bread at all. It had always been about refusing against every cruel expectation the world had placed upon her to stop believing she was worth saving. She had proven to a town that once doubted her, and to herself most of all, that a woman's worth was never measured by her size, her circumstances, or the lies powerful men told about her. It was measured only by what she chose to build when everything else was stripped away, and by who stood beside her unwavering while she built it. And in the end, that unbreakable belief was the truth that had saved them all now, and for every sunrise still to come.